In a 2016 interview with The Guardian, Tom Kenny, the voice of SpongeBob, described the show as having comedic archetypes of human behavior that have worked for hundreds of years, further back than even Shakespeare. Because in it, you have SpongeBob, the idealist, confronted with archetypes of cynicism and chaos. SpongeBob approaches life with a bright, bubbly attitude. His overly optimistic, sunshiny, I'm ready personality is what breathes life into the show. And his personality actually stems directly from series creator Stephen Hillenburg. Stephen Hillenburg has been described by his colleagues as possessing the same bright, colorful optimism found in SpongeBob, and that's because, like any great artist, he injected much of himself into the show. From childhood, Hillenburg was instilled with a profound sense of curiosity, a curiosity that was informed by his obsession with the 1966 television show The Undersea World of Jacques Cousteau. Hillenburg described the show as being given a lens through which to peer into a whole nother world, and this wide-eyed fascination with exploration and finding new worlds is what led him to study marine biology, eventually becoming a marine biology teacher at the Orange County Marine Institute in Dana Point, California. Alright, so here we are at the Marine Institute in Dana Point, California, since renamed to the Ocean Institute. This is where Stephen Hillenburg taught as a marine biology teacher before he became an animator. And so you can come here to learn about the ocean. Right. Yeah. It was here at the Marine Institute that Hillenburg created the Intertidal Zone, a comic book aimed at educating children that also contained a prototype character of SpongeBob called Bob the Sponge. And it was this comic book that impressed Jules Engle, a former Disney animator turned university professor who then invited Hillenburg to study at Cal Arts. And it was at Cal Arts that Hillenburg studied experimental animation under Jules Engle, and then eventually released his thesis film Wormholes at the 1992 Ottawa International Film Festival. And it was at this film festival that Hillenburg was noticed by Nickelodeon animator Joe Murray, who then invited Hillenburg to work with him on Rocko's Modern Life. And after working on Rocko's Modern Life, Stephen Hillenburg went on, of course, to create SpongeBob. And so that's the story of how Stephen Hillenburg came to create SpongeBob. But it all started with an interest in marine biology inspired by Jacques Cousteau. The importance of Jacques Cousteau's influence on Stephen Hillenburg cannot be understated. In SpongeBob, the very first words of the pilot episode are uttered by the French narrator.
2 hours later.
A character who Hillenburg has directly stated as being based on Jacques Cousteau.
Ah, the sea. So fascinating. So wonderful. Here we see Bikini Bottom, teeming with life.
And just as much as Jacques Cousteau invited 1960s children to view new, inspiring oceanic underwater worlds in his television show, Stephen Hillenburg strove to build a vivid, flourishing world in the city of Bikini Bottom. Because one of my favorite aspects of SpongeBob in the first 3 seasons is the very distinct and unique audiovisual identity Hillenburg set out to create with Bikini Bottom. A rock, a pineapple, and an Easter Island head sitting on the same street as the primary basis for the entire show. Who thinks of that? At first it seems like such a random assortment of objects put together, but one could also point out that this single setting roughly represents the California surfer culture Hillenburg grew up in as a child, a culture which itself derived primarily from Polynesian and Hawaiian influences. And the rock is, well, a rock. Hillenburg also stated that he wanted to use a pineapple because it seemed fun, while an Easter Island head felt more stoic, and a rock was, well, stupid. But beyond this street, Hillenburg and his animators put so much effort into developing a unique tropical oceanic identity in Bikini Bottom. And one of the most innovative ways they do so that I love is the drawings of flower clouds in the sky that are ubiquitous in every episode. There is no basis in reality for flowers appearing in the ocean or sky, but whoever came up with this idea is a genius because these simple flower clouds, if seen anywhere, are immediately recognizable as uniquely and unequivocally SpongeBob.
Ooh, you know what that cloud looks like?
What?
A flower.
They all look like flowers, SpongeBob.
All the time?
They sure do.
Even Kenny Pittenger, one of the artists working on SpongeBob as a layout supervisor, stated that even he had no idea what the flowers actually were, but apparently Hillenburg came up with them to evoke the look of a flower print Hawaiian shirt. Another visual element I love is the constant use of the speckled paint splatters to give a sandy, oceanic texture over every surface, and how with the sand specifically, multicolored speckles are used for an almost colorful confetti-like coral effect, adding a subtle hint of fun. And lastly, one of the most ingenious methods SpongeBob uses in setting atmosphere is, I urge you to watch any SpongeBob episode, and during any scene, if you ignore the voices or characters speaking in the foreground, you'll begin to notice you hear sounds like these. Oceanic ambient sounds and the steady undulations of underwater rumblings and bubblings are playing quietly in the background of every single SpongeBob episode, and it plays just barely noticeably so as to seep into your subconscious and lull your brain deep down into the show's watery subaquatic atmosphere. If you don't believe me, I'm telling you, just watch literally any SpongeBob episode or scene, and you'll suddenly find out you spent hundreds of hours of your childhood listening to underwater ambient background noises without even realizing it. But SpongeBob's distinct identity is far from limited to only maritime influences. In a lot of ways, the first 3 seasons of SpongeBob feel like an homage to the 1950s and 60s golden age of classic cartoons. The wacky, surrealist humor and slapstick gags with SpongeBob feel right at home with the comedy greats and animation pioneers of Looney Tunes and Hanna-Barbera. If you think about it, despite coming out in the 90s and 2000s and being a universal staple for children growing up in that period, the actual setting of the early seasons of SpongeBob doesn't feel like it takes place in the 90s or 2000s. There aren't really any skateboards, boy bands, or CD players that would feel more stereotypically representative of this time period. Instead, more dated technologies like phonographs and vintage box television sets are used, and things like the voice and aesthetic of the realistic fish head news report sound straight out of a 1950s television newscast.
We interrupt this can-can for a special news bulletin!
Or how the early episodes of Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy are clearly a spoof of the 1960s superhero television shows like Adam West's Batman. And a lot of production music used seems to deliberately give off a mid-century transatlantic vibe. For example, these songs here. In fact, a lot of the production music library is directly sourced from songs written during or before the 1960s. One can argue that this was an artistic choice to help make the show feel more timeless and not feel restricted to any specific time period or generation. But I'd argue that, just like how 1960s Jacques Cousteau had an indelible effect on Stephen Hillenburg and consequently the show SpongeBob, I feel like by extension, SpongeBob as a whole feels like a recreation of Hillenburg's 1960s childhood, that the show is a careful conglomerate reconstruction of his early aspirations and influences. This makes sense because Stephen Hillenburg grew up in 1960s Southern California, when surfer culture and the Beach Boys were rampant, and as the curtain was just beginning to close on the golden age of animation. And Hillenburg has also stated on numerous occasions that many of the characters of SpongeBob were based on various vaudeville and comedy acts he watched growing up, from Jerry Lewis to W.C. Fields. And the entire reason I'm talking about all this is because I believe what makes the first 3 seasons and the first movie of SpongeBob so special is the deeply personal and unique identity Stephen Hillenburg imbued from himself into these episodes. Stephen Hillenburg had a clear and unparalleled vision for his show when he first pitched SpongeBob to Nickelodeon executives in 1997, and it was a pure vision that continued to shine through the first 3 seasons of the show, because it was a vision that could only come from Hillenburg himself. As many viewers of SpongeBob probably already know, Stephen Hillenburg intended for the 2004 SpongeBob SquarePants movie to be the series finale of the show, and he wanted SpongeBob to end there. But of course, Nickelodeon, seeing the lucrative cash cow they had on their hands, wanted the show to continue, and so, after the release of the SpongeBob movie, Stephen Hillenburg left his position as showrunner. But not just Stephen Hillenburg. In a Season 1 commentary video, Stephen Hillenburg cited specifically 2 people as being utmost essential in developing SpongeBob into fruition as it was, and those 2 people were creative director Derek Drymon and art director Nick Jennings, both of whom Hillenburg met while previously working on Rocko's Modern Life. And so it should come as no surprise that Derek Drymon and Nick Jennings also both left SpongeBob after 2004, undoubtedly with many of the original animators and other staff members as well. I don't want to discount the work of any artists or cast members who continue to work on later seasons of SpongeBob. I'm sure new episodes of SpongeBob have lots of talented people working on them, and these later seasons are perfectly capable of being well written and enjoyed by new audiences. What I do want to say though is that these seasons are not the same show as what Hillenburg created. It's a different show with a different, meandering identity. And the show that I fell in love with the show whose absurdities and endearingly clever wit I will exclusively restrict my thoughts and analysis to, is the show created in the first 3 seasons by Stephen Hillenburg. And to quote showrunner successor Paul Tibbitt when speaking about Stephen Hillenburg, he said, "In the animation business, there always used to be a sort of joke. When you run out of ideas, you just do Muppet Babies. Steve would always say to me, one of these days, they're gonna wanna make SpongeBob babies, and that's when I'm out of here." And we know how that went. But going back to my overall point, I just wanted to say that I admire the first 3 seasons of SpongeBob due to how much Stephen Hillenburg put himself into it. From his admiration of Jacques Cousteau, to his inspiration from cartoons and comic acts from his childhood, Hillenburg held a clear vision for his series. Stephen Hillenburg also stated that the 1999 album The Mollusk, performed by the rock band Ween, was also a huge influence on the making of SpongeBob. And just a cursory glance at the album's cover, which depicts a horrific pastiche of various writhing, wriggling maritime fauna surgically fused together into a psychedelic display of marine body horror, this artwork echoes the many bizarre and surrealist elements that would become staples of SpongeBob's signature humor. But more than anything, and where I want to bring back the quote I mentioned at the beginning of this essay about the interplay of moral forces in SpongeBob, more than anything, what Stephen Hillenburg inserted into the heart of the show is a bright and warmly glowing optimism. When Stephen Hillenburg came off from working on Rocko's Modern Life, a show rife with biting satire and dirty innuendos, he wanted to create a show that was pure in intention and innocent at heart, just like himself. In a 2010 interview with issue number 17 of Hogan's Alley magazine, Jay Lender, a writer for SpongeBob, said, "Steve was the guiding light behind everything that happened in SpongeBob. There was a sequence in Neptune's Spatula where SpongeBob is competing against King Neptune to see who can make the best Krabby Patty. All my gags were about SpongeBob doing things carefully and precisely, and when we were punching up the show before the pitch, Steve sat down on the floor and drew the bit where SpongeBob draws ketchup faces on the pickles, tucks them in under a blanket of cheese, and reads them a bedtime story. I saw that and knew why he was the boss." In another quote, Eric Coleman, a studio executive, said, "I know that he was not intending any kind of subversive undertone to the show. He's not the type of artist or writer who is trying to sneak in inappropriate double entendres or adult humor. And that's one of the things I admired about him. How pure and innocent that show is, yet how it manages to be fresh and irreverent in places while still being heartfelt and sincere. At the heart of SpongeBob the show is a purity and earnestness that, in a world of absurdities and frequent uncertainties, if we fill our hearts with kindness the way SpongeBob does in the face of adversity, the world will bend itself to us without us trying. This pure and idealistic optimism is what guides SpongeBob out of the many moral conflicts he faces, and it's what's captured the hearts of millions of children and adult watchers alike, as this optimism shone brightly amidst the noisy sea of millennial television programming and high-pitched, spongy yellow. This optimism, which permeates through the entire moral structure of SpongeBob, is where I'm going to end the introduction of this video. And it's where I want to lead into the real topic I actually want to talk about for the remainder of this essay. I want to talk about what happens when you witness the death of Hillenburg's beloved optimism. I spent much of the introduction of this essay building up to how Hillenburg's personal idiosyncrasies and SpongeBob's innate optimism helped differentiate the show from the rest of the television landscape when it first debuted. But going back to the opening quote I used at the beginning of this video, SpongeBob's optimism by itself does not make the show. Rather, it's the juxtaposition of SpongeBob's optimism against other moral forces amidst the surrealist fabric of Hillenburg's and his writer's vivid imagination that gives SpongeBob its defining touch. There should be no doubt that SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward are the 3 most important characters in the show's narrative and themes. When Hillenburg first pitched the show to Nickelodeon executives in 1997, he constructed an aquarium with miniature versions of specifically SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward to help visualize the show with its most important characters. There's a reason why these 3 specifically live on the same street next to each other. But while it's obvious that SpongeBob would be the most important character, who would be the second most important character? Now, it would be easy to say that importance is subjective, and that Squidward and Patrick fulfill different, equally necessary roles, and are thus equally important, but for argument's sake, if we had to choose one, who would it be? One way we can analyze this is by doing a count of every episode each character appeared in, and so for this video, I took it upon myself to manually conduct a count for each of the 10 main characters, and as mentioned previously, I'm only considering episodes from the first 3 seasons for my analysis. Looking at the results here, we see that SpongeBob, Squidward, and Patrick are clearly in the lead, as they are the 3 most important characters, and thus the 3 most frequently appearing characters. And surprisingly, we see that Squidward has slightly more appearances than Patrick, with 90 episode appearances compared to 84. But ranking by number of episode appearances alone shouldn't be informative enough, because what if the majority of a character's appearances are only minor appearances, cameos, or supporting roles? Instead, I think it'd be more important to do a count of when an episode credits a character as having a major role. And so I took it upon myself again to read through the SpongeBob wiki and manually count the number of major appearances each character has across the first 3 seasons of SpongeBob. Looking at the results, again we see SpongeBob coming in first place with 112 major appearances, and Patrick and Squidward again bringing in the top 3, again leading by a wide margin. And now we have Patrick coming in second place instead of Squidward with 47 major appearances compared to 43. But it's still relatively close between the two, which is where I want to bring attention to SpongeBob's 112 major appearances. For those who didn't notice, this is a 5-episode decrease from his 117 total episode appearances. Because of all 117 episodes of the first 3 seasons, there are only 5 episodes where SpongeBob has a supporting role or minor appearance, and they're the ones listed here. Of these 5 episodes, 2 are primarily narrated by Plankton, 1 is an episode primarily narrated by Mr. Krabs, and the last 2 are episodes primarily narrated by Squidward. Which made me realize a question I want to answer myself is, who is the most frequent primary narrator of each episode? There isn't really an official record of this, of who is the single most main character of each episode, so this was something I had to calculate myself, watching every episode myself and determining who I thought the main character of each episode was. And I tried to be as objective as possible, and so for data transparency's sake, I will include the results in case anyone would like to dispute. But when determining a main character of each episode, I looked at who was the primary person driving the plot forward, who was at the center of the episode's conflict, or who had the most lines. And after deciding all that, here are the results I came up with, and the results may surprise you. Across the first 3 seasons, only 5 different characters are given the opportunity to be the primary narrator of an episode, and for 3 of these characters, it's only a handful of times. And as for Patrick, despite being indisputably one of the most important characters in SpongeBob, he has shockingly 0 appearances as the primary narrator of any episode in the first 3 seasons. There are no episodes that primarily center around Patrick or are primarily told from his point of view. Patrick is undoubtedly an important character in the series. He is essential for helping elevate the show's signature absurdist humor, and that is because he is chaos.
Is mayonnaise an instrument?
He is pure, uncontrollable id. Whatever random thought or impulse he has, he acts upon it, no matter how ridiculous it is. And this chaotic nature gives him a flexibility that allows for SpongeBob's writers to use him for their zaniest, silliest ideas, and it makes for great fun.
I'm Squidward, I'm Squidward, 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 Squidward.
This chaotic nature is why some of SpongeBob's writers have been quoted as saying Patrick is their favorite character to write for. But it's the same chaotic nature that makes him unreliable as a standalone character, as Patrick so aptly puts it.
The inner machinations of my mind are an enigma.
This enigma is best preserved if we do not peer into Patrick's mind, or let him narrate his unpredictable thoughts. Instead, his chaos is best used in an auxiliary measure, to enhance interactions with other characters, whether it be being a loyal friend and enabler of SpongeBob's antics, or accidentally bringing misfortune onto others. His primary role is that he adds an absurd flavor to more grounded narratives, but by himself, his behavior is too unpredictable and erratic to be the source of a consistent narrative. Not saying that this isn't possible, or that this isn't eventually explored in later seasons, but it explains why there are no such episodes narrated by Patrick in the first 3 seasons. Anyways, looking back at the chart I made earlier, what I most wanted to point out is there's only one other character besides SpongeBob with a substantial number of episodes where they get to play the leading role. There's only one other character in the entire show besides SpongeBob who consistently gets to play the main character, and that character is Squidward, with 20 episodes, or more than 1/6 of the first 3 seasons, dedicated to being told from his point of view. Squidward is my favorite character of SpongeBob. He's the character I made a stupid rap song about 3 years ago on this YouTube channel.
Big nose, gross toes, has no hair, and to this day we ask as he finished those errands. Feature, past history is the all-time goat, sweet victory. From your Easter Island head to the Krusty Krab, say goodbye to all your haters and finish with the dab.
And he's the character I've decided to write an entire essay about right now because I think he's the most interesting, most relatable, and the most tragedy-stricken and compelling character in the entire show. Here's a fun fact. Did you know that Squidward was actually the second character created in the entire show after SpongeBob? Derek Dryman, the creative director of SpongeBob, said that in his very first meeting with Hillenburg, the very first pitch idea they discussed involved SpongeBob and Squidward specifically going on a road trip together. Well, while that road trip idea never completely got made, it did eventually get worked into the episode we know today as Pizza Delivery. And also, did you know that the very first recording of Tom Kenny as SpongeBob was a conversation between him as SpongeBob and Stephen Hillenburg playing Squidward?
Hundreds of creatures swim through these doors every day in our undersea community, depending on you to serve them nutritious, delicious, reasonably priced food in a clean, family-friendly environment.
Look! I've been standing around on my tentacles since 8 o'clock this morning, and I don't have the strength to listen to this.
Who depends on you, you may ask? Well, let's just start with the A's. Aaron Anchovy, LB Albacore.
But the reason I mentioned all this is that it's important to note that the very first two characters Hillenburg came up with were SpongeBob and Squidward. Not anyone else, but SpongeBob and Squidward. SpongeBob and Squidward are as essential to the show and to each other as peanut butter and jellyfish jelly. They are each other's direct foils. They are as opposite day can allow. And yet they work together to bring out the very best storylines in the entire show.
We're like brothers, only closer.
It is incredibly ironic that, despite Squidward loathing the presence of SpongeBob, they are probably the most frequently appearing characters in each other's lives. In SpongeBob, there are two major settings where scenes consistently take place: SpongeBob's neighborhood and the Krusty Krab. And besides SpongeBob, Squidward is the only character who appears in both settings, because the writers made an effort to include Squidward in SpongeBob's life as much as possible. So why? Why is Squidward so important? There's a reason why Squidward was chosen to be the second most frequently occurring main character after SpongeBob. It's because he's the most normal character in the entire show. Compared to SpongeBob and Patrick, he's the adult in the room. He's the more level-headed voice of reason, and his disgruntled reactions to SpongeBob and Patrick's acts of tomfoolery are often perfectly reasonable and valid. It's just unfortunate that he has to abide by the laws of living inside a cartoon. The world of SpongeBob is surreal and strange. Later in this essay, I want to talk about why the rules of this universe are so bizarre and how they seemingly work so unfairly against poor Squidward. But because of Squidward's contrasting rationality, he is often the best candidate to be a stand-in for the audience during the show's weird and wacky moments, because his bewildered reactions mirror our own, which is why he is so often used as an episode's primary narrator. But more than just being normal, Squidward's primary strength is that he is relatable. A common sentiment I've seen in online forums and in the comments of YouTube videos when talking about SpongeBob is something along the lines of, childhood is looking up to and wanting to be like SpongeBob. Adulthood is realizing you've become Squidward. Squidward is the most relatable character on the show. In fact, in my opinion, he is the most human character of the show. One of my favorite qualities of Squidward is that, despite his aloof demeanor, he very often ends up subjecting himself to some of the most depraved and wretched displays of human behavior seen on the show, because so often is he pushed to the limits of outrage and abject misery. No one else is pushed to the edge of absolute insanity like Squidward is in this show, and it works comedically because it's such a contrast to his normally level-headed character. Whereas SpongeBob is squeaky clean and intended to be a role model for children, Squidward is much more flawed, bearing more open wounds, and is thus more human. To me, Squidward is more man than Squid, and it's why I think he's the most interesting character of the show. But yes, Squidward is normal, he is relatable, he is human, but even more so, beyond being human, I want to say that Squidward is the embodiment of eternal suffering. This is starting to approach the very main part of what I actually want to talk about for this video. Suffering. There is no life experience more human and relatable than suffering. And Squidward suffers a lot in this show. He is in constant pain throughout the entire show. And so, before we delve into this mighty topic I spent so much time working up towards, let me give you a tiny sampler platter of just how much Squidward has suffered throughout this entire children's TV show, because I took it upon myself to watch every episode of the first 3 seasons of SpongeBob, and I made a spreadsheet to record every single instance of excruciating physical pain inflicted on Squidward throughout the entire show, and I edited all these moments together into a 5-minute clip for you to enjoy. Because I want to impress upon everyone watching the utter hell Squidward has been forced to endure for our entertainment. And so, after much exposition, let's take a break from my analysis and let me present to you Squidward, a compilation of pain and suffering.
Firmly grasp it!
Mediocre clarinet player.
Try the one on the right.
Everything but the shirt off my back. You stink! Are you sure you should be poking him like that? Will we be getting business cards?
More life belongs in the trash! Litter.
No. And then you blow up.
Holy fish paste! I think it's a Here lies Squidward's hopes and dreams. What a baby.
They're chained, so I had to eat them!
254 times. Over 90 episode appearances, Squidward experiences a somewhat subjectively calculated form of suffering 254 times. We can see that he is involved in explosions 8 times throughout the series, and he trips and falls down 22 times throughout the series, and he is stung by jellyfish only 4 times throughout the series, which I thought would be a lot more. But anyways, having watched that little compilation, I think it should be clear that Squidward suffers immense pain extensively throughout the entire show. But why? Why is Squidward subjected to this unending torture? Schadenfreude is defined as the experience of pleasure derived from another person's misfortune. Squidward experiences pain because it's funny to us. But why? Why do we enjoy watching Squidward in pain? Well, perhaps it stems from a sense of moral superiority. It's why people love to gossip. It's why when we were kids at school, we'd all go, ooh, when someone got in trouble. It's why we ridicule people from opposite sides of the political spectrum on the internet. Watching the misfortune of others makes us feel good about ourselves, because the suffering of others, especially of those we feel are different from us, their suffering reinforces the perceived security of our own belief systems. At the very beginning of this video, I talked in length about how SpongeBob is a beacon of optimism. He loves jellyfishing and fry cooking, he loves his friends, and he's always happy and saying, "I'm ready." Meanwhile, on the opposite end of belief systems, we have Squidward, a cynic, a curmudgeon.
Easter Island head like house, obviously the curmudgeon in town.
A world-weary pessimist who has constant disapproval of SpongeBob's antics, because he is not ready. And so perhaps his suffering is an ethics lesson to children watching that if you approach life with cynicism and a sneering condescension like Squidward, like this bad guy, then you will suffer just like him. It's imparting a lesson of moral superiority in SpongeBob's approach to life. So that's one way to look at the purpose of Squidward's suffering. Another way I want to look at it though is in the context of Greek tragedy. In tragedy, the purpose of suffering is to invoke catharsis, or a pain that awakens pleasure in the audience. There is a therapeutic emotional release in the audience when we witness suffering. We want to purge the pain felt by characters because we want to purge a pain that we might also feel within our own lives, because we often relate to or can empathize with the trials and tribulations and humanistic flaws experienced on screen. The hubris, the anguish, and the obsessions and unfulfilled desires, these are all elements of suffering we might already feel or anticipate that we will inevitably feel at some point in our lives. And tragedy is the purging of these emotions to help placate a pain existing in our lives, which is just a very roundabout way of me wanting to say that Squidward is relatable.
He's Squidward, you're Squidward, I'm Squidward! Are there any other Squidwards I should know about?
Meow.
I'm out of here.
One key difference that separates Squidward from the rest of the SpongeBob cast, and that makes him feel deeply human, is that he is a character who habitually wants something. He characteristically wants something more than what his life currently offers him. To be recognized for his artistic talent, to find material wealth beyond his drab, inconsequential job as a cashier, to rid himself of nagging, pestering nuisances in his life. Who can't relate to things like this? Meanwhile, you have characters like SpongeBob and Patrick who are very content with the current paradigms of their lives. SpongeBob is more than happy to be ecstatic about being a fry cook, which most would consider to be a less than glamorous job. He and Patrick find incredible enjoyment in simple activities like jellyfishing and bubble blowing, or even more mundane things like a cardboard box and a piece of paper. They find happiness in their lives as it is, and are content to never change from who they are. Unlike Squidward, they do not want more from their lives. You might argue that SpongeBob wants a driver's license, and that is true, but despite failing the driver's test hundreds or even thousands of times, never once does SpongeBob express disappointment or frustration with being unable to pass his driver's test. Instead, he'll merely shrug it off and look eagerly forward to the next opportunity, much to Mrs. Puff's chagrin. You might also argue that Mr. Krabs is a character who very obviously wants money, but I'd argue that Mr. Krabs is more miserly and stingy than he is actively greedy. he's often more concerned with maintaining his existing wealth than he is with ambitiously introducing new expenditures to increase his wealth. Most of the cast, and even the citizens of Bikini Bottom as a whole, appear to be content with the natural order of their lives, and Squidward stands out from the crowd with his dissatisfaction. One notable exception, of course, is Plankton, who consistently wants the Krabby Patty formula, and is constantly also dissatisfied that he's unable to get it, which is why he and Squidward are both often placed as antagonistic forces in SpongeBob's life. It's because of their characteristic need to want something, or even Mrs. Puff's want to get rid of SpongeBob as a student. This inherent need to have wants seems to be at odds with the moral code of the SpongeBob universe, because these wants are basically never fulfilled or met, and these characters are consequently always very unhappy. And it's this suffering and unhappiness that makes these characters feel deeply human, and it's why they've all been offered roles to be leading narrators in SpongeBob episodes. But why? Why is it so wrong, so condemnable to simply want something? A defining quality of having wants, and not just SpongeBob, but in many cartoons, is that these wants will never be fulfilled. Elmer Fudd will never catch Bugs Bunny, Wile E. Coyote will never catch the Roadrunner, Tom will never catch Jerry, Mr. Crocker will never catch the Fairy Godparents, and Team Rocket will always be blasting off again. And Squidward will never find happiness from his suffering because cartoons are instantiated with inevitability. Cartoons have long-standing trends of inevitability because, well, mostly because capitalism thrives on longevity, and allowing characters to change and achieve their goals will result in no more story being available to tell. But that aside, inevitability also exists in cartoons because the children who watch them find comfort in stability and predictability. When our minds are still forming and young, any new change to our environment can feel overwhelming because it'll be so different from the few experiences we know. And so we seek to begin adopting patterns when we can. There's a reason we all have nostalgic recollections of coming home from school on sunny afternoons and running inside to turn on the television after memorizing the channel Nickelodeon was running on. And there's a reason we found consolation in reliably knowing that SpongeBob would always be running at the same time, and knowing that it would always deliver the funniest jokes, and that the characters would always act the way we predict them to act. We look on nostalgic memories more fondly because they contrast with the more unpredictable and uncontrollable nature of adulthood. Adulthood feels like Squidward, because adulthood also often feels like having to come to terms with inevitability. About a year ago, I made a YouTube video about the anime movie Your Name, and at the end of the video, I somehow went from talking about the themes of the movie to my own life situation, about how at the beginning of last year, I was single, rejected by a girl, jobless, and I didn't really know what I was doing with my own life. And a whole year has passed, and I am still single, still jobless, and I still don't know what I'm doing with my life. A whole year has passed and nothing has really changed, and the things I want I still don't have, and I just want to say that I'm feeling a lot like Squidward. And I think we all sometimes do. We might want a better job, or a better school, or to capture the heart of that one special girl or guy you really want more than anything to be with. We might want to be rich and famous, to be able to support ourselves with our interests and enjoy what we do, and feel like we can make a difference in this world. We might want all these things, but sometimes, or a lot of the times, we don't get what we want. Sometimes, like Sisyphus, we might wonder, will it get better? And maybe it won't. Sometimes we get stuck with mediocre jobs, or no jobs at all, or we don't get accepted into our dream school. We fail to meet our goals, we get rejected by the people we love, and we settle for what we don't like, and the world stays an unhappy place. And the things we want, even most desperately, we never get. And so it is in this cloud of disillusionment and inevitability that we might become plagued with a cold and bitter cynicism. We doubt our own ability to get what we want, and maybe we even feel worthless when perceiving ourselves, or we might feel the entire world is absurdly and unfairly working against us. But in the midst of all this hopelessness, we still want the things we want, but just as enduring are our wants, so is the ever-present fixture of inevitability. And this paradox can create a never-ending loop that might possibly contribute to driving ourselves into a maddening, all-consuming obsession, eternally suffering and hurting ourselves because we always want what we can never get. Eternal suffering. This, to me, is the tragedy of obsession and futility. Well, this video essay just took a very dark turn, but obsession and futility is very much the heart of the essay I wanted to talk about this entire video, because I'm not going to deny that many of my video project ideas are incredibly influenced by my own personal views and circumstances, because in my own life, I struggle with wavering between optimism and cynicism. And wanting to talk about this made me eventually realize SpongeBob, of all things, is the perfect vehicle for me to explore and study this topic. And so, after much exposition, let's tackle this thesis and jump into some episode analysis. The first episode of SpongeBob, Help Wanted, is the episode where SpongeBob applies for a job as a fry cook at the Krusty Krab. The very beginning of the episode sees SpongeBob optimistically waking up and energetically going through his morning routine before leaving his house and confidently declaring his catchphrase for all of colorful Bikini Bottom to hear, "I'm ready." The beginning of the episode immediately sets up SpongeBob as a bright, innocent character filled with hopefulness and wonder, introducing the central moral compass that will direct the course of the entire show, which is when we transition to Squidward. In Squidward's first appearance, he wears a frown. His voice is flat and monotone. His very first lines are expressing contempt and then panicked disapproval of SpongeBob's presence at the Krusty Krab. Just as easily as SpongeBob's optimism has begun conceptualizing in the audience's minds, Squidward is quickly established as the singular oppositional force in SpongeBob's journey. Something that the writers of SpongeBob have talked about in interviews and documentaries is praising the simplicity of Hillenburg's vision and how easily his character's motivations are conveyed and understood. Because if you think about it, the very first episode of SpongeBob, Help Wanted, is basically a battle between two opposing forces, SpongeBob's desire to work at the Krusty Krab and Squidward's cynical desire to keep him out. And we all know who wins in the end, which is where I want to talk about a central idea to the show that was so important it was introduced in the first episode, and that is the absurdity of hope. In Help Wanted, Mr. Krabs gives SpongeBob an impossible task of finding
hydrodynamic spatula with, port and starboard attachments and, turbo drive. And don't come back till you get one.
A hydrodynamic spatula with port and starboard attachments and turbo drive. This is obviously a made-up contraption that is not meant to exist, but the big comedic payoff of Help Wanted is that SpongeBob somehow finds it. In many instances throughout the show, SpongeBob discovers irrational solutions to problems or situations that go against logic or reason. For example, he finds the hydrodynamic spatula. He effortlessly blows bubbles that inexplicably have magical lifelike elements. He drives a rock. His entire house grows back from a seed with interior furniture intact. He inexplicably gets adoration and applause for mopping the floor. He inexplicably moves an audience to tears with tuneless, very non-clarinet sounding singing. He is inexplicably able to do straight up magical things with a piece of paper. He inexplicably and effortlessly makes masterclass art with nonsensical methods. He miraculously obtains food that literally falls out of the sky while literally doing nothing. He is inexplicably able to generate realistic cinematic sound effects out of thin air from within a cardboard box.
Will you two shut up?
He becomes an expert waiter and redesigns the entire interior of the Krusty Krab in a matter of seconds, and he somehow avoids a sea bear attack simply by drawing a circle in the sand. Many times throughout the show, SpongeBob demonstrates absurd ability, and very inexplicably, he repeatedly circumvents reality and subverts expectations of what should happen in the natural world, and often does so without any explanation or self-awareness that what he does should be illogical. So why? Why does SpongeBob have absurd ability? Well, first off, SpongeBob is a cartoon. Cartoons, fundamentally, should not be realistic. Elements of absurdity are what make cartoons fun and humorous to watch. And that didn't really need an explanation. But also, what I've noticed is that SpongeBob's feats of absurdity are often used in instances to counteract cynicism or some form of negativity. And this is usually in a contrasting relation to characters like Squidward. For example, he finds the hydrodynamic spatula, which in effect undermines Squidward's selfish efforts to exclude SpongeBob from the Krusty Krab. He effortlessly blows magical lifelike bubbles because he's simply having innocent fun and enjoying an activity he likes, an activity which Squidward tries to disapprove of and mock. He drives a rock, which contradicts Squidward's continuous doubts about SpongeBob's claims about the pioneers, and thwarts Squidward's selfish attempts to eat the pizza.
Who cares about the customer?
I do.
Well, I don't.
Oh, Squidward.
That's just a stupid boulder.
It's not just a boulder. It's a rock.
His entire house miraculously grows back as if to thwart Squidward's spiteful wishes to get rid of SpongeBob. He miraculously gets praise from an audience for the mundane act of mopping a floor because his intentions are pure-hearted, whereas Squidward's performances are motivated by self-interest and ego. He again receives adulation from an audience, which Squidward is frustratingly never able to do, even in his own dreams, and again, this all stems from what the show is trying to say about the core motivations of each character. SpongeBob's magical abilities with a piece of paper are given much more meaning when compared to Squidward's stunning lack of ability to do anything fun with a piece of paper. The contrast is meant to show Squidward's lack of imagination or his inability to see the innocent fun that can be inherent to even simplicity. SpongeBob's ability to effortlessly create masterful art again serves to undercut Squidward's selfish ambitions. While Squidward is motivated by pursuit of fame and glory, SpongeBob has never demonstrated any interest in such things. Squidward was also initially reluctant to host SpongeBob and dismissive of SpongeBob's abilities, only becoming open to it when it could potentially serve his own self-interest, which is of course when SpongeBob's abilities conveniently disappear. SpongeBob is rewarded with food while Squidward starves because Squidward is being morally punished for ridiculing SpongeBob and Patrick's faith in the magic conch and trying to ruin other people's fun.
Praise the magic conch!
SpongeBob is able to have fun with the cardboard box while Squidward isn't because, like before, he has ridiculed yet another of SpongeBob's and Patrick's pastimes, and the contrast in their abilities is meant to highlight the difference in their worldviews. SpongeBob's abilities are meant to topple any sense of intellectual superiority or snobby elitism Squidward might feel, and having fun with things that aren't necessarily sophisticated, cultured, or even rational can be just as valid forms of fun.
Not as long as we have our imagination.
SpongeBob is momentarily able to showcase fine dining expertise, but because Squidward is, as typical, motivated by self-interest and a desire to gloat, the facade quickly crumbles. And lastly, his nonsensical method to protect himself from a sea bear mostly works because, again, it contrasts Squidward's doubt and mockery of SpongeBob and Patrick's beliefs. Over and over again, SpongeBob demonstrates absurd ability. And every time it happens, this absurdity is meant to act as a countermeasure to some other morally condemnable force at play, oftentimes a facet of Squidward's cynicism or pragmatism. It's like the show is encouraging children watching to not be pessimistic and have doubts like Squidward, to not act primarily out of self-interest, and to not mock or ridicule the innocent fun of others. And that makes sense from the standpoint of wanting to present wholesome children's programming. But what I find interesting is that a show must resort to absurdity to resolve optimistic intentions. It's no surprise that animation as a medium or fiction as a tool is often used to realize what can't be achieved in reality. In real life, things don't always work out so cleanly where if you're true to yourself and hopeful about the future, things will work in your favor. Sometimes it just doesn't. And so in stories we tell, where as artists we are in control, we create ideal worlds and scenarios where things do work out that way to preserve our vision of how things should be, of how we want them to be, even if it means resorting to unrealistic methods. But more importantly, what I've also thought about is, how does Squidward feel about all this from his perspective? From Squidward's perspective, he must feel that the entire world is unfairly and cruelly working against him, that what should make sense doesn't, and that no matter what he does, the structure of the world has been fundamentally coded for him specifically to always fail. And normally, from anyone else, that might sound like an absurd conspiracy, but for him, he's not wrong. The writers of SpongeBob are fully in control of his fate, and they are quite literally concocting ideas to inflict as much pain and suffering on him specifically as much as possible. But ignoring the metaphysical aspect, what does Squidward's inevitable suffering mean in a metaphorical sense? Because yes, very often throughout the show, we see the world of SpongeBob working irrationally against Squidward's endeavors. SpongeBob should not have been able to find a hydrodynamic spatula. It was supposed to be an impossible task, and the fact that he not only finds it, but is able to feed hundreds of anchovies at once, and does so to Living in the Sunlight by Tiny Tim, one of the most random choices for a song for a children's television show you could think of, from the perspective of Squidward, this must all be so extremely bizarre. The first episode of SpongeBob, from Squidward's perspective, is quintessentially absurd. So, what is absurdity? Absurdism is, by definition, the philosophical theory that the universe is irrational and meaningless. And everything SpongeBob does in Help Wanted is chaotic, unpredictable, and irrational. And this irrationality renders any efforts or desires Squidward might have as meaningless, because there is nothing Squidward could have done to stop SpongeBob from succeeding, because SpongeBob's actions defy logic. And this irrationality extends outside of SpongeBob to the real world as well. Absurdism is an actual philosophy because in real life, we often feel like many things are outside of our control, like the politics of the world or our own personal circumstances. We can get into a car accident or catch a disease, and poverty and war will forever be ongoing, and an asteroid could even hit. It's all so chaotic that we should cease trying to find meaning in any of it. It is pointless to have wants in this intractable system. And so for decades, artists have striven to capture this insanity through wildly bizarre and surreal depictions of the world in paintings and music and poems and children's television shows. The absurdity of the world can be interpreted in the many zany and inexplicable events Squidward faces, and also the overwhelming sense of futility that follows. I find it interesting that the second episode of SpongeBob, and still part of the first episode when viewed in conjunction with Help Wanted, chooses to focus on a conflict between SpongeBob and Squidward. The second episode of the entire show arguably centers around Squidward as well, as it both opens and closes from his perspective, and the majority of the episode's plot revolves around the various acts of suffering inflicted upon Squidward. Again, the fact that this was chosen alongside the pilot as the very first airing of the show speaks to the fundamental role Squidward and his relationship to SpongeBob plays for the series. The beginning of the episode sees Squidward noticing a single shell besmirching an otherwise sparkling clean sand lawn, and he selfishly kicks it onto SpongeBob's lawn, which then leads to a series of events where Squidward continually undergoes pain and suffering. And at the end of the episode, his lawn becomes dirtier than ever before, and to add insult to injury, the single shell from the very beginning of the episode falls squarely back onto his nose. For sure, the episode is preaching a moral tale that Squidward should never have selfishly kicked the shell onto someone else's lawn to begin with, but I also sense the beginning of a trend of inevitability, where no matter what Squidward did, the shell would always fall back onto his lawn. How could he have predicted that SpongeBob would have such an obnoxious device with the Reef blower that could suck all the water out of the ocean and spit it back out? That's quite absurd. And so the disappointed expression on Squidward's face as the shell floats disrespectfully onto his nose as he lies under a pile of sand in defeat, this is Squidward resigning to futility. And we continue to see a trend of absurdity and futility when concerning Squidward throughout the rest of the show. In Home Sweet Pineapple, Squidward spends much of the episode celebrating that SpongeBob is finally leaving. But, defying all logic and reason, the entire house magically grows back with furniture intact and lands flat on Squidward's face, quashing his wishes while literally crushing him as if to signify the beginning of a trend of how absurdity will punish Squidward specifically. In Pizza Delivery, one of the most iconic episodes of the series where SpongeBob and Squidward get lost in the desert trying to deliver a pizza,
Rusty Cray, yeah, pizza, it's the pizza, yeah, for you and me.
the episode is resolved when SpongeBob nonsensically gains the ability to drive a rock. which nobody could have predicted, but the even more absurd punchline of the episode is that the customer ordering the pizza lived right next to the Krusty Krab, rendering SpongeBob and Squidward's journey almost entirely pointless. In Dying for Pie, this episode is actually one of my all-time favorite episodes of SpongeBob because it probably has the most absurd premise of the entire series.
Hi there. Those homemade pies sure look good.
Oh, these aren't homemade. They were made in a factory. A bomb factory. They're bombs.
The fact that there are pirates making pies, and that the pies are bombs of all things, and the pirates tell this to Squidward's straight face that they are bombs, but Squidward buys it anyways, and the fact that SpongeBob sees the pie, then licks his lips and thanks Squidward for the pie, but doesn't actually eat the pie, and the fact that Mr. Krabs has somehow seen this before, 11 times before in fact.
You've seen this before?
11 times, as a matter of fact.
And just somehow knows that the bomb won't explode until it hits SpongeBob's lower intestine at precisely sunset, as opposed to exploding, I don't know, right away, and that this all causes Squidward to go on a cavalcade of self-deprecating tasks to check off items on SpongeBob's bucket list because he thinks SpongeBob is going to die. It's all so stupid. It's the stupidest, most genius episode I've ever seen written, and I absolutely love it. And the cherry on top of this entire episode is that SpongeBob didn't even eat the pie! Squidward's journey this entire episode was completely meaningless, and everything is absolutely futile and absurd. And of course, the proverbial explosive pie gets thrown in his face in the end. But I think that the episode that best exemplifies absurdity and futility in the show for Squidward is Club SpongeBob. This is the episode where SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward get stuck in a forest, and SpongeBob and Patrick decide to do nothing but listen to the whims of a magic conch. And before I go on, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page that Squidward is the most normal and sane person in this episode. He does absolutely nothing wrong, and yet he is the one getting punished for his sanity in this episode. The joke of this episode is that SpongeBob and Patrick only listen to the magic conch.
Praise the magic conch!
Which is this drawstring voice box toy, and Squidward rightfully thinks that this is stupid. And the magic conch first tells SpongeBob and Patrick that they should do absolutely nothing when lost in the forest.
What do we need to do to get out of the kelp forest?
Nothing.
And again, in real life, this should be incredibly stupid advice, and Squidward is absolutely correct for thinking this magic conch is moronic. And yet SpongeBob and Patrick are rewarded for their idiocy. An entire cargo of food miraculously falls out of the sky and falls neatly in a picnic right at their location. It makes no sense at all, but it happens. And this is peak absurdity at its finest. Absurdism posits that life is irrational and meaningless, and the magic conch telling SpongeBob to do nothing is almost asking him to submit to this meaninglessness, and letting the chaos of the world bring about the most unpredictable situation of a literal picnic falling out of the sky. And afterwards, we see the world of absurdity work against Squidward when the magic conch repeatedly rejects Squidward's requests for any food.
Magic conch, I was wondering, should I have the spaghetti or the turkey?
Neither.
Oh, then how about the soup?
I don't think so.
Could I have anything to eat?
No.
This drawstring toy that seemingly should not have any sentience appears to have a grudge against Squidward specifically, and the fact that SpongeBob and Patrick enforce its restrictions, denying their clearly starving friend any food because a conch toy told them to do so, it's all very ridiculous, and Squidward has every right to feel like he's going insane. And so the biggest comedic payoff of the episode comes when a forest ranger arrives to seemingly save the day. But it turns out he is also a follower of the stupid magic conch. And again, the magic conch tells them all to sit and do nothing which they follow. And the final resolution of Absurdity comes when Squidward 2 joins the group and throws up his arms in praise and resignation, saying,
All hail the magic conch!
All hail the magic conch. Squidward's final admission at the end of the episode is him coming full circle and surrendering to the irrational, absurd world he inhabits. The world makes no sense, it can arbitrarily work against him, and there is nothing he can do about it. And so he realizes he has no choice but to relinquish his sanity and join the idiots around him and literally do nothing. In effect, submitting to the futility that absurdism indoctrinates. Club SpongeBob is a classic episode when trying to interpret the show through absurdist philosophies, but the madness doesn't stop there. The Graveyard Shift is another nonsensical masterpiece from the series involving both SpongeBob and Squidward. This is the famous episode with the hash-slinging slasher.
The hash-slinging slasher.
The sash-ringing, the trash-singing, mash-flinging, the flash-springing, ringing, the crash-dinging, the...
Yes.
Where Squidward tells a story about a fry cook who lost his hand and died, and who would periodically come back to haunt the Krusty Krab. But before he did, the lights would flicker on and off, the phone would ring and no one would answer, and finally, the hash-slinging slasher would arrive on the bus that ran him over. Anyways, all these things happened, but as improbable as it may be, it's explained that the hash-slinging slasher was just someone who wanted to apply for a job at 3 a.m., who called earlier but hung up because he was nervous. But the most memorable joke of the episode occurs when Squidward wonders who turned the lights on and off. After which it cuts to a black and white image of a 1920s movie vampire, and then everybody seems to recognize him, and they knowingly say, Nosferatu! This is a vampire that has no business being underwater or in a children's television show, and almost certainly none of the intended audience would have had any idea who this character actually was, and it makes no sense at all that this vampire would be turning on and off the lights in the Krusty Krab, and that the characters of SpongeBob would somehow recognize him and just accept that this is a plausible explanation to anything. The joke is so incredibly out of left field, and the episode just abruptly ends there, and it is complete nonsense. But it's also one of the funniest and most memorable moments of the entire show. But basically, it again demonstrates that there is no actual rhyme or reason to the logic of the SpongeBob universe. Everything is absurd. Trying to rationalize anything would be futile, and there is nothing anybody can do about it, except laugh. Other episodes demonstrating the world of absurdity and Squidward include Shanghaied, where SpongeBob and Patrick bring Squidward onto the Flying Dutchman's ship, where he gets burned alive 5 times in a row by snot fire, then thrown into a nightmarish hellhole and seemingly endless freefall filled with nonsensical horror, only to get wished back onto the ship by SpongeBob and Patrick, who waste 3 wishes and get him turned into fruit and presumably eaten by the Flying Dutchman. It's an absurd situation that ends only hopelessly for Squidward and the fools he gets himself mixed up with. Anyways, next up is the Great Snail Race. In this episode, SpongeBob and Squidward quarrel over whose snail can win the race. But in the end, the most absurd outcome occurs when Rocky, Patrick's literal rock with no legs or biological vitality whatsoever, somehow wins the race. So it didn't matter at all how much either SpongeBob or Squidward tried. It didn't matter how much they wanted to win. The stupidest outcome would have happened even if it doesn't make any sense. Squidward gets a brief period of hope when Patrick tells him that he had the trophy engraved with his name. But again, hope proves to be futile when the trophy is revealed to have his name misspelled as Squidward Tortellini.
To Squidward Tortellini! Will I ever win?
That's for yesterday, SquarePants!
In Chocolate with Nuts, Squidward wants to reserve a dinner at a restaurant on his only night to be fancy, but finds out that the entire restaurant has been rented out by just SpongeBob and Patrick, who found their earnings by selling all their chocolate to a crazy person.
Chocolate? Chocolate! 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 Chocolate!
And so again, Squidward's plans are foiled by absurd situations. In I Had an Accident, SpongeBob fears anybody slapping his butt because if he damages it any further, he'll get the iron butt, which is one of the wildest premises for an episode I've ever heard, but one of the funniest jokes of the episode is when there's a 7-mile long spanking machine, where people willingly crawl under a 7-mile line of people to have their butt repeatedly slapped, which is the silliest thing I've ever seen. But the funniest part about this bit is that Squidward, of all people, with his grumpy, no-nonsense attitude, he appears to participate in this odd kink fest.
Is this where the line starts?
Anyways, this has nothing really to do with absurdity when concerning Squidward and Futility. I just thought it was funny. The reason I mentioned this episode, even though it has little to do with Squidward, is that I believe it is generally one of the most absurd episodes of the show. And that's because it contains probably the most bizarre ending of any episode of the entire series. And it's when Patrick, wearing a gorilla suit, meets a Patrick suit worn by a live-action gorilla, which itself is very obviously a live-action human in a gorilla suit. And the gorilla proceeds to brutalize SpongeBob and his friends, doing so with no problem at all until SpongeBob asks the most sane question in a situation that makes very little sense.
You know what I don't understand, though? What? What's a gorilla doing underwater in the first place?
What is a gorilla doing underwater? After which, the gorilla starts speaking in a normal human voice, then is joined by a zebra, on which he rides off into the sunset, after which the camera cuts to a confused suburban white family watching this all unfold, who then exasperatedly turn off the TV. Everything about this ending is just so goofy and knowingly self-aware at how absurd and bizarre everything is. Everything about this ending is nonsense, and when the episode reaches the zenith of absurdity, it just abruptly ends, because there's nothing you can really do once all the cards are just thrown off the table. Like, what was the purpose? What was the point? There is none. It's meaningless. It's absurd. Anyways, the last episode I want to interpret with respect to the world of absurdity inside SpongeBob is one of the most brilliant episodes of the series, and it is the camping episode. This is the crowning jewel of all episodes when it comes to relishing and Squidward's suffering, and he does so at the expense of peak absurdity in the form of a sea bear. What the heck is a sea bear, and why does it hate Squidward so much? I personally see the sea bear as a metaphor for how the entire strange world of SpongeBob, with all its unpredictability and arbitrary irrationality, seems to have one thing in common, and that is a unified hatred for Squidward specifically. Squidward gets mauled by a bear 6 times in a row in this episode, and he does nothing wrong in this episode. You can argue that he's in the wrong because he ignores SpongeBob's warnings and deliberately does all the things that antagonize a sea bear when he was specifically warned not to do those things, and thus he deserves his punishment. But in his defense, the rules are nonsense. First off, bears don't exist in the ocean. And secondly, why would playing a clarinet, or waving a flashlight, or stomping around, or eating cube cheese, or wearing a sombrero, clown shoes, and a hoop skirt, why should any of that matter when concerning a sea bear, or literally anything? It's such an arbitrary list involving what should be a mythical, non-existent creature. Like Club SpongeBob, Squidward has done nothing wrong in this episode except commit the crime of being completely normal. And yet absurdity makes him bend the knee, and in the end, he finally submits and enters the circle drawn in the sand, which to any normal person would rightfully think it should do absolutely nothing. It's a circle drawn in the sand. But like the end of Club SpongeBob, Squidward accepts the insanity nonetheless because he has no other choice. Because as ridiculous as the rules of SpongeBob and the Sea Bear are, there seems to be a unifying philosophy throughout the series in that this ridiculousness should be respected. Just because you don't understand it doesn't mean you should reject it. If we re-examine the overarching philosophy of absurdism, absurdism posits that life is irrational and meaningless, but it doesn't dictate that you can't be happy. In fact, it asserts that accepting the fundamental meaninglessness of life is the first step a person must take to becoming happy. If Squidward just went along with SpongeBob and Patrick's shenanigans, even if he knew it didn't make sense, and just tried to have fun, he could have saved himself a lot of pain. Learning to coexist with irrationality, to harness the chaos and let go of your traditional expectations and just have fun with it. That is what I call the absurdity of hope. And that's a philosophy that I think SpongeBob can very much get behind. But going back to the perspective of Squidward, we spent quite a while compositing all the episodes in which the absurdity of the world weighs a burden over Squidward's wants, how surrealism and literary nonsense work together to construct this comical reflection of the real world, where people get nothing they want and only meaninglessly suffer. But what are Squidward's wants? What does Squidward want in this irrational universe? Well, first and foremost, Squidward wants to be a world-renowned artist, be it in painting, dancing, fine dining, or, most obviously, clarinet playing. BubbleStand is the first episode where we see Squidward's artistic aspirations because it's the first time we see him playing the clarinet, but after throwing on a pompous performance, he blows up in a giant bubble. In Plankton, we see him get called a mediocre clarinet player, because a common theme throughout SpongeBob is that Squidward's artistic aspirations are either ridiculed or never realized. In Naughty Nautical Neighbors, we see more of Squidward's refined tastes. He bakes cakes, he paints, and again, he plays the clarinet. But he also chokes on his food, and SpongeBob, pretending to show appreciation for his music, accidentally ruins one of his paintings and destroys his bassinet.
Are you kidding? I've been playing bassinet for years!
In Jellyfish Jam, we see him play the clarinet again, and the jellyfish hate it so much, they electrocute him.
Wait, I can turn it down.
In Opposite Day, SpongeBob pretty much mocks Squidward's clarinet playing while pretending to be Squidward in front of a realtor, and Patrick destroys another of his paintings. And in Squidward the Unfriendly Ghost, SpongeBob and Patrick destroy a clay sculpture Squidward made. In SB129, the prehistoric versions of SpongeBob and Patrick go absolutely berserk when they hear Squidward's awful clarinet playing. In The Paper, SpongeBob makes better music than Squidward's clarinet playing with a literal piece of paper. In Fools in April, SpongeBob pulls a prank on Squidward by telling him that someone from the Barnacle Bay Art Museum wanted to honor him as Artist of the Month. In Sleepy Time, even in his dreams, Squidward will still get ridiculed by an audience after clarinet playing. And speaking of dreams, he also dreams of playing piano serenely on an island and dying for pie, but he's really woken up from his dream having to return to his drab life at the Krusty Krab. In Squidville, he gets to play the clarinet every day, but strangely, he becomes tired of it, insinuating that maybe there's something more he might want beyond artistic aspirations. And in As Seen on TV, he almost directs a commercial for the Krusty Krab boasting a high production value, but Mr. Krabs shuts it down. And in Can You Spare a Dime, Squidward becomes homeless, and because nobody would take his paintings, he had to eat them. In a camping episode, SpongeBob and Patrick panic at Squidward playing the clarinet because sea bears are attracted specifically by bad clarinet playing. Not just any clarinet playing, but bad clarinet playing.
It's too dangerous to play the clarinet badly out here in the wilderness.
And in Pranks a Lot, SpongeBob and Patrick interrupt Squidward's painting session by painting a mustache on him. So far, what we have seen is that Squidward prefers more cultured, intellectual pursuits, or just calmer, more mature activities like sunbathing, like in Muscle Buff Pants, The First Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy, I Was a Teenage Gary, Squid's Day Off, and Procrastination. He can be seen sunbathing. And basically, Squidward seeks to indulge himself in elevated forms of entertainment. He seeks to differentiate his interests from what he perceives as the more banal forms of entertainment in which SpongeBob and Patrick participate, which is kind of relatable. We all want to feel smart or better about ourselves. We all want to think we have good taste in food or music so that we can appear cool to our friends or people we meet. It's why in Chocolate with Nuts, Squidward subscribes to Fancy Living Digest.
This guy's so rich, he has a swimming pool in his swimming pool.
This guy's got shoes.
Give me that! Stealing my mail, eh?
Squidward wants to feel intellectually and culturally superior to SpongeBob and Patrick, and more than anything, he does not want to be put in the same bucket as them. And let's be fair, they're idiots. But it's a common trait to want to feel like you're more gifted or have more talent than others. We're constantly told to work harder, look better, be richer, or be smarter, that we must separate ourselves from the rest of the crowd in order to feel worthwhile. And so Squidward might feel a need to socially separate himself from the rest of Bikini Bottom, to put himself on a higher plane than them, and tell himself that they don't possess the mental capacity needed to understand his genius.
Squid's got genes! Squid's got genes!
And maybe that's why he feels entitled to be so grumpy all the time, because it's nice to want to think like that we might be better. But what if Squidward isn't talented? What if his taste in music is just bad? Because very often, as we've seen, his talent is repeatedly rejected by audiences, and his clarinet playing is frequently denounced as awful and torturous upon the ears.
Yeah, we're with the pet hospital down the street, and I understand you have a dying animal on the premises.
And so how might that feel, to be ridiculed in the one field you use to distinguish yourself with? There are 2 episodes in particular that focus on Squidward's failures as an artist. The first is Culture Shock, where Squidward hosts a talent show at the Krusty Krab, and he does so with the ulterior motive of wanting to showcase his own talent. Throughout the episode, Squidward impatiently waits for his turn to perform, and when the time finally comes, the audience hates his performance, booing him, paying money to throw tomatoes at him, and chanting at him, "No talent! No talent!" As an aspiring artist, this must be the most awful reception he could have hoped for. But the most insulting moment arrives when SpongeBob comes in mopping the floor, and then SpongeBob is showered with the applause Squidward so desperately wants.
That's really not too bad. All right. Oh my gosh.
The irony of this moment cuts especially deep when considering how Squidward previously spent much of the episode scoffing at SpongeBob's talent, dismissing SpongeBob's earnest and imaginative ideas, because Squidward felt he had a superiority in discerning taste. And yet SpongeBob, the one person Squidward holds in least regard, is able to earn far more applause than Squidward with basically zero effort, which might seem to highlight a vast divide in their ability, and that Squidward is the inferior one, which is utterly humiliating. Squidward even tries copying SpongeBob's exact actions by mopping the floor, but still receives radio silence from the audience, thereby confirming that the applause has nothing to do with the talent displayed, but instead with the person exhibiting the talent, and that the world has been predisposed against Squidward specifically to not applaud him for any talent, which is an absurd realization. Squidward has probably devoted his entire life to studying the arts, hoping to be recognized by his peers, but instead, they shun him. And yet SpongeBob gets exactly what Squidward wants, what Squidward has been denied, by mopping the floor. If I was in that situation, I would go insane, and I would rightfully believe that the world was unfairly working against me, and I would be very unhappy, and I would hate everything. Or maybe, just maybe, it isn't about absurdity, and it isn't about talent, and maybe it's simply about Squidward being a selfish, unlikable person. But never mind that. If I was Squidward, I would go insane. And so, speaking of going insane, I now want to examine the second episode related to the failure of Squidward's artistic endeavors. Artist Unknown. This is the episode where Squidward teaches an art class, but the only person who shows up is SpongeBob. And like Culture Shock, SpongeBob demonstrates superior ability to Squidward in every medium with little to no effort. Or not even just little effort, but nonsensical effort. The methods SpongeBob uses to arrive at his results make no sense, like starting from a face and drawing backwards to arrive at a circle, or just touching a marble and then poof, a statue pops out. His methods make little to no sense, and thus offer little hope of being recreated. And this must be incredibly frustrating to Squidward. Later, a renowned art curator named Monty P. Moneybags stops by, and he also belittles Squidward's art.
I call it bold and brash.
More like belongs in the trash!
But, of course, he becomes instantly enamored with SpongeBob's sculpture, which Squidward selfishly takes credit for when Monty offers him fame and fortune. But then, they clumsily break the sculpture, and Squidward tries to get SpongeBob to build him a new one, which is when SpongeBob, ever so modest and humble, offers to follow Squidward's teachings, only to be an abject failure.
I don't know, Squidward. That stuff's not in the book.
And so Squidward not only loses his only avenue to fame and fortune, but he is reminded that his methods are worthless, that by himself he really has no talent, because SpongeBob followed everything he said and only produced a pile of rubble. And so, Squidward snaps. He absolutely loses it. He flies into a psychotic rage. He goes insane because he hates his situation and feels there is nothing he can do, which then leads to the most ironic joke of the episode, which is when Monty returns at the end to claim his sculpture, and he gasps in astonishment at some off-screen spectacle and asks who is responsible. Squidward, not looking back at the wreckage he caused, dismissively transfers responsibility to some random janitor and stomps out of the building, which is when it is revealed that Squidward actually sculpted some amazing lifelike masterpiece, and that this lucky janitor instead will harvest the fruits of Squidward's rage-induced labor.
You, sir, are the greatest artist who ever lived!
So the irony is that Squidward maybe does have talent, but the world is still absurdly working against him because even with his one success, he is completely oblivious to it and does not get to reap any of the benefits. The man just cannot win. But what I want to focus on is how Squidward only succeeds after completely losing it and going off the rails, how he was pushed to the psychotic edge, and when he felt he had no options, he is reduced to the most pitiful state of self-hatred and raw, unfiltered rage. This is where I want to talk about Squidward's obsession. Many times throughout the series, the mature and collected Squidward completely loses his cool and is driven to madness by the various obsessions he has. BubbleStand is the only episode outside of the first two pilot episodes where Stephen Hillenburg is directly credited as a writer. And I believe that's because it's one of the most critical episodes of the series, because it's the very first episode to clearly show the interplay between SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward, as it's the first episode to focus entirely on these three characters alone. And it's also the first episode to clearly showcase Squidward's introduction to obsession and futility. Because in BubbleStand, he maniacally screams into a bubble wand until a giant bubble is formed. And he screams because he was frustrated that he was unable to produce anything before. And it's kinda left open to interpretation as to whether he was able to produce this bubble due to his own ability, or if it was because he somewhat followed SpongeBob's technique.
Let's go like this. Spin around, stop. Double take three times. 1, 2, 3.
And here we go.
Have a thrust. Woo!
Oh,
Stop on your right foot. Don't forget it.
Don't forget it.
Now it's time to bring it around town. Bring it around town. Then you do this, then this, and this, and this, and that, and this, and that, and that.
Or if this giant bubble is even comparable to SpongeBob's creations to begin with. Nevertheless, the next joke is that in Squidward's momentary period of hubris that follows, the giant bubble of his creation carries his house into the sky and then explodes, presumably causing him some sort of suffering and pain, and the dejected clarinet tones that play afterwards signal a sort of resignation to absurdity, a resolution to futility in the face of maddening obsession. an opposite day, after SpongeBob and Patrick ruin his plans to move, Squidward angrily chases them with a plow truck. An Employee of the Month, both Squidward and SpongeBob are driven to obsession in their mad dash competition to get to the Krusty Krab first and become Employee of the Month. And because of the show's overarching philosophy concerning characters who have obsessive wants that should never be fulfilled, Squidward and SpongeBob both fail to achieve their goals, and the destruction of the Krusty Krab symbolizes the futility of their obsessions. But the episode that I think is one of the best to represent Squidward's relationship with obsession and futility is another of my favorite episodes, and that episode is The Paper. The Paper begins with Squidward unwrapping a candy from a piece of paper and then absent-mindedly tossing aside the crumpled up piece of paper. This opening reminds me a lot of the opening to Reef, which both imply that Squidward's senseless acts of littering serve as justification for his suffering later on in both episodes. But anyways, after throwing away the piece of paper, SpongeBob notices the paper on the floor and pesters Squidward if he would like it back, which Squidward repeatedly refuses, famously saying,
"And promise me, no matter how much I may beg and plead and cry, don't give that paper back to me. Ever!"
And then SpongeBob goes on to have the most illogical fun one can possibly have with a piece of paper. He pretends to be a superhero, a jungle man, uses the paper as a parachute, makes multiple origami pieces that suspiciously should require more surface area and incisions to make than the original singular small piece of square paper would provide, somehow uses it as a helicopter, and somehow makes music with it. None of it makes sense, but he does it anyways. And this is when Squidward realizes he wants the paper back. Throughout the episode, there is a growing tinge of regret and longing to have the paper back, which grows into full-blown obsession, with Squidward eventually giving away absolutely everything he owns, his house and the shirt off his back, just to get back a stupid piece of paper. As illogical as it might sound, as absurd as it might be, Squidward throws away his principles and his dignity to get this paper back, because the more he's denied a want, the more he becomes obsessed with chasing that want, even to the point of self-desecration. The Paper is an amazing episode to me because it so succinctly showcases the themes of everything I've been talking about in this essay, from the frustrations with absurd ability to the imminent self-destruction resulting from obsession and futility. When Squidward finally receives the paper at the end, it's a Shakespearean tragedy at its finest, because the paper is nothing at all like he hoped for. Squidward is brought back to reality when he realizes he's just holding a stupid piece of paper. And the irony comes full circle when Patrick, the dumbest character in the show, also recognizes the paper for the trash it is and uses it to wrap a piece of gum he's throwing away, just like the candy Squidward unwrapped at the beginning of the episode, leaving Squidward feeling like the world's biggest loser because he now has absolutely nothing, having lost absolutely everything for absolutely no reason at all. The Paper to me is the quintessential obsession and futility episode, but what exactly is Squidward obsessed with? I believe that Squidward isn't intrinsically obsessed with the paper, but instead, he was obsessed with wanting the happiness SpongeBob expressed when playing with the paper. The pure, optimistic joy SpongeBob showed while playing with the paper with sheer simplicity, this was a joy Squidward felt was missing in his own life, that has eluded him his whole life. And he became obsessed with wanting a chance to recreate and introduce that joy into his life. But he wrongfully believed that the happiness came from the paper itself, which is why he directed his obsessions towards attaining the paper, when really the capacity for happiness comes not from the paper, but instead from the person who holds it. Which is why Squidward was fundamentally incapable of withdrawing any happiness from the paper himself. Happiness can only come from himself, which he did not possess. But yeah, feeling dissatisfied with our lives, like a certain something is missing from our lives, and becoming captivated with, obsessed with what we might see as any opportunity or chance to fill in that missing hole that made us incomplete, that to me is a universal experience that we all can relate to, that can be gleaned from this cartoon show about a piece of paper. And so it's no wonder that Squidward would become obsessed, with wanting to do anything, with even giving up everything to try and imitate what he lacks. And it's only harrowing, but also all too relatable that even after losing everything, Squidward still falls short. And so, is this a journey inevitable to futility? Well, we'll see. When talking about the paper, I think it's impossible to not also mention Idiot Box, which I feel is a companion episode with many parallels. Instead of Squidward eating a candy and throwing away a piece of paper, SpongeBob and Patrick throw away a TV and keep a cardboard box. And SpongeBob and Patrick do silly, magical things with the cardboard box, just like how SpongeBob did silly, magical things with a piece of paper. And intrigued by absurdity, Squidward becomes increasingly distracted with intrusive thoughts obsessing over the cardboard box, and he becomes increasingly dissatisfied with his own life choices and circumstances as well.
And welcome back to Championship Boxing!
I guess this is okay. I mean, it's not really about boxes. I give up.
And both episodes end with Squidward trying out the paper and the cardboard box, but in both cases, he fails to recreate the magic and it blows up in his face in the end. Another tragic defeat at the hands of futility. The next episode I'd like to talk about concerning obsession and futility is Squid's Day Off. This is the episode where we see Squidward at his most obsessive and at the height of his delirium. After Mr. Krabs has an accident trying to save a dime, Squidward is left in charge of the Krusty Krab, which he sees as an opportunity to skip work and take the day off. But this is when Squidward begins to have uncertainty about leaving SpongeBob in charge. And this uncertainty eventually grows into suspicions, and then these suspicions warp into full-blown malice and delusion. And by the end of the episode, Squidward has again utterly debased himself and lost all sense of decorum after fully giving in to his obsessions. And his obsessions are again all for naught, because not only did SpongeBob never do anything, but it's revealed that they accidentally forgot to change the Krusty Krab's open sign, meaning Squidward really could have taken the whole day off.
It's almost like we could have taken the whole day off. Ah! Ah!
And so Squidward's wrinkly head deflating in exasperated defeat is him once again resigning to futility. But yeah, this episode is noteworthy because of all the episodes, this one shows Squidward at his most unhinged, his mental state reduced to cackling while running naked in the street. It shows the full extent of depravity one can reach when fueled by obsession. And the root of Squidward's obsession in this episode is his fundamental distrust of SpongeBob.
Repeat after me. You will not go back to the Krusty Krab.
I will destroy the Krusty Krab.
Squidward can't bring himself to see SpongeBob as an equal, as someone capable of running the Krusty Krab by himself. And obsession warps this distrust into delusion when Squidward believes that SpongeBob might even have malicious intent, believing that SpongeBob would even absurdly and irrationally appear in his bathtub just to spy on him. And he's so deluded that he doesn't even see the hypocrisy in trying to catch SpongeBob leaving his post when he, Squidward himself, has left his post. But even though SpongeBob has plainly demonstrated absurd ability in the past, the irony is he really doesn't do anything at all in this episode. It really calls into question the validity of Squidward's worldview. Is the world really so absurd and revolving against him as it seems? Or is there something to address with his insecurities regarding himself and SpongeBob? Why is he so predisposed to think lesser of SpongeBob? Is he projecting inner feelings of jealousy and frustration with his own inadequacy? Is the fundamental root cause of all his pain and suffering really the workings of a cruelly absurd and unjust world? Or does the primary responsibility lie within himself? Maybe the only thing absurd is the cynical way he looks at the world.
All done with those errands? How are those errands going? Have you finished?
No!
Have you finished those errands? 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 Have you finished those errands?
No, I am not finished with those errands, and I never will be! So quit checking up on me!
Does that mean you're...
Yes, SpongeBob! I am finished with those errands.
Other episodes that I feel are exemplary of obsession and futility include Squidville. where Squidward gets fed up with SpongeBob and Patrick and finally leaves to a new neighborhood filled with other squids. Or octopi, I guess. But he quickly becomes disappointed with the monotony, and in a callback to the beginning of the episode, and also to the second episode Reef Blower, where he was previously annoyed by SpongeBob antics, he assumes the role of tomfoolery himself and giddily launches into the sky using a reef blower. It's a subversion of roles and another stark demeanor change for Squidward that again calls into question, what does Squidward really want? He constantly complains about SpongeBob and Patrick, claiming he can't find happiness when near them. He moves to a new neighborhood with seemingly everything he should want, but he can't find happiness there either. And so he basically almost snaps and devolves into silliness, and so this gleeful insanity, is this the happiness he truly wants? In Snowball Effect, Squidward initially resists the idea of engaging in snowball fights with SpongeBob and Patrick, thinking it juvenile and beneath him. But he eventually becomes even more obsessed with it than SpongeBob and Patrick, building a huge fort and becoming paranoid that he's under attack. But it turns out in the end he isn't fighting anyone, and there's just a large tree dropping snow on his head. And again, like in Squidville, we start to see hints of similarities with SpongeBob beginning to emerge in Squidward. He initially shows disdain at snowballs, at reef blowers, at bubble blowing, and cardboard boxes and pieces of paper, but he eventually becomes obsessed with all these things because, consciously or not, he's chasing a desire to become like SpongeBob. But why? Why does he do that? Well, keep on watching and maybe we'll find out. Artist Unknown and Club SpongeBob, which we've already talked about, are other perfect examples of Squidward showcasing intense rage and obsession that also resolve to futility. But the last episode I want to talk about regarding obsession and futility, and particularly Squidward's relationship with SpongeBob, is yet another episode where Squidward shamelessly debases himself, and it is Just One Bite. This is the episode where Squidward claims he has never eaten a Krabby Patty, and when SpongeBob finally convinces him to take just one tiny nibble, he instantly falls in love with it. But his love is at direct odds with his pride and his refusal to admit he was wrong to SpongeBob. Squidward has an antithetical relationship with SpongeBob, where SpongeBob represents the opposite of everything Squidward stands for.
No, Squidward, I meant good for your soul.
Oh, please. I have no soul.
SpongeBob is optimistic while Squidward is cynical. SpongeBob is friendly to everyone he meets while Squidward sneers at others with condescension. SpongeBob is content with his life and enjoys being a fry cook while Squidward hates his life and loathes being a cashier. Because they have such an opposite relationship, in order to feel secure about his own life choices, Squidward probably deems anything associated with SpongeBob and anything different from him as inferior, which is why he really did not want to try any Krabby Patties. But beyond that, because Squidward is so contemptuous of SpongeBob, he's fearful of showing any forms of weakness or vulnerability in front of SpongeBob, which is why the thought of SpongeBob finding out he likes Krabby Patties is so painful to him. We hate giving any satisfaction to the people we don't like. But the allure of Krabby Patties has an ironclad grip on Squidward's gullet. Krabby Patties are an almost mythical entity in the world of SpongeBob. As a kid, one of my dreams has always been to eat a Krabby Patty. Look at that's a painting of the Krusty Krab right there. It's a great advertisement for the show to subconsciously associate its imagery with kids' favorite food, hamburgers. Kids like hamburgers, SpongeBob has a lot of hamburgers. Kids like SpongeBob. And the mythos behind the Krabby Patty, with the secret recipe and how everybody loves it, and Plankton's obsession with it, the Krabby Patty is a central component to SpongeBob and one of the most iconic inventions of the series. But anyways, I just mentioned all this to explain how Squidward is compelled towards obsession when pursuing the Krabby Patty, to the point of licking sand off the ground and eating food out of the trash. The allure of Krabby Patties is mythical and absurd, and thus representative of the world of SpongeBob at large. But more than this, Squidward becomes obsessed with Krabby Patty because it's the first bite of happiness he's ever felt in a long time. Just like I mentioned with the paper, Squidward is obsessed with wanting to taste happiness, because Squidward's entire existence centers around suffering and the denial of any gratification or pleasure. And so consuming the Krabby Patty, or sitting inside a cardboard box, or blowing bubbles and playing with reef blowers and throwing snowballs, These experiences to him are like taking a first step into this other side of the world he's never seen before. And it's a place where for the first time in his wretched life, he can finally feel happy. And so he becomes obsessed with chasing this feeling, even though it feels completely at odds with everything he stands for, because it's also a realm where SpongeBob resides. Squidward has a fundamental distrust of SpongeBob. They're supposed to be each other's polar opposites, and so Squidward feels he should strictly disavow anything associated with SpongeBob. It's why he always has initial contempt for SpongeBob's artistic talent or his hobbies. It's why he can't trust SpongeBob to look after the Krusty Krab. He feels an instinctual need to look down on that which he perceives as different from himself. But realizing that SpongeBob may be more similar to himself than not, drives Squidward into obsession. And so, in the end, Squidward eats so many Krabby Patties, he blows up. Futility.
No, worse! It'll go right to your thighs!
My thighs?
And then you blow up!
Anyways, I've spent a ton of this essay talking about the world of SpongeBob, about how it can be absurd and cause Squidward to become obsessed and then cynical when he realizes his actions are futile. But where I want to end this video essay, as we begin to enter the final section of this character analysis, I want to bring it back to the very beginning, to what I believe is the heart of the show. And what I want to examine is the fundamental relationship between Squidward and SpongeBob. We've talked before about Squidward's wants, about how he's always denied his wants. We've said he wants to become a world-renowned artist. We said he just wants to be happy. But what else does he want? Well, throughout the series, Squidward continually wants to get rid of SpongeBob, because numerous times throughout the show, SpongeBob and Patrick annoy the heck out of him. For example, SpongeBob blows sand all over his lawn. SpongeBob blows really loud bubbles that disturb his morning routine. SpongeBob does an unflattering impression of him, saying Squidward is trying to be boring. SpongeBob and Patrick are responsible for bringing about a series of excruciating pain on him for little to no reason when they basically coerce him to go jellyfishing. They blow up his house, they let a house fall on him, they disturb his sunbathing. SpongeBob plays extremely loud music, which leads to Squidward getting stung by jellyfish. SpongeBob and Patrick break into his house and kidnap him when they idiotically think he's an alien. SpongeBob annoys him with incessant boot squeaking. SpongeBob and Patrick again break into his house celebrating his birthday when it isn't his birthday, and then they unintentionally sabotage his plans to sell his house. They crush his clay sculpture and send him to the sky in a giant bubble. They keep asking him over and over again to go jellyfishing. SpongeBob ruins his dream. SpongeBob annoys him with a Valentine. SpongeBob pulls April Fool's pranks on him. SpongeBob makes him provide excellent service for a non-paying bubble customer. SpongeBob and Patrick blow up his house a second time. They get him tortured and eaten by the Flying Dutchman. They get him brutally beaten up by a cartoon drawing. They get him thrown into and lost in a forest where he starves and is denied food by a conch toy. They're a nuisance with loud noises they make from their cardboard box. SpongeBob accidentally tortures and traps him with Mermaid Man's belt. SpongeBob and Patrick extinguish his fireplace and throw snowballs in his face. They read his mail and reserve an entire restaurant on his only day to be fancy. They yell annoyingly in his presence. SpongeBob does another unflattering impression of him, saying that Squidward thinks he's surrounded by idiots. SpongeBob throws flowers in his face. SpongeBob and Patrick get him mauled by a sea bear. And lastly, they paint a mustache on him while pretending to be ghosts. As you can see, there are many instances where SpongeBob and Patrick are nuisances to Squidward, and so multiple plot threads of SpongeBob are about Squidward wishing he could get rid of SpongeBob, or actively trying to get away from him. But it never works out, because, as I've talked about before, what Squidward wants, what he obsesses over, usually never resolves in his favor. Naughty Nautical Neighbors is the episode where Squidward tries to turn SpongeBob and Patrick against each other, but it ends up backfiring with both of them annoying him even more, and when he tries to get them back together, they blow up his house. This is actually one of my favorite episodes because, along with BubbleStand and Jellyfishing, these are the 3 episodes at the very beginning of season 1 that clearly set up the dynamic between SpongeBob, Patrick, and Squidward. And of these 3, I think this one has by far the best title. Naughty Nautical Neighbors is actually one of the episodes I own an animation cell for. As some people might know, the first season of SpongeBob was traditionally animated on physical celluloid sheets called cells, and so this is the original frame where Squidward opens the door to see SpongeBob and Patrick standing, blinking, amongst the wreckage of his destroyed house. And it's a full setup with the bubbles and even the original background painting, and this was the very first animation cell I ever bought and one of my favorite things I own. But anyways, Squidward's plans to antagonize SpongeBob and Patrick fails miserably in this episode. One of the realizations Squidward has in this episode is that he needs SpongeBob and Patrick to need each other, and getting rid of them entirely will be a lot trickier than he thought.
Squidward is my best friend in the world. Squidward is my best friend in the sea.
In Boating School, when SpongeBob says, "I'm ready," Squidward mocks him saying, "Ready to move?" expressing his desire for SpongeBob to move. In Home Sweet Pineapple, he celebrates the possibility of SpongeBob moving, but instead, the house grows back and falls on top of him. In Nature Pants, we see Squidward again celebrating when SpongeBob leaves to live among the jellyfish. But of course, SpongeBob ends up coming back.
I miss you! Sandy misses you! Even Squidward misses you!
In Opposite Day, he comes up with a plan to prevent SpongeBob from interfering with his plans to leave by telling SpongeBob to act the opposite of himself. But again, his plan backfires because telling SpongeBob and Patrick to act the opposite of themselves causes them to pretend to be Squidward, and they enter his house and mess with the real estate agent, and Squidward is again unable to rid himself of SpongeBob and Patrick, and again his wants go unfulfilled. In I Was a Teenage Gary, Squidward relishes the thought of SpongeBob and Patrick leaving for a weekend, but ends up forgetting to feed Gary, which eventually leads to him getting turned into a snail. In Squid's Day Off, Squidward's motivation for taking the day off is to be away from SpongeBob, but he never spends that much time away from SpongeBob in the end. In Squidville, which we've talked about a bit already, Squidward again tries to leave SpongeBob and Patrick, but again it doesn't go as planned because he becomes bored and unhappy, and we begin to see that Squidward might end up sharing a lot more in common with SpongeBob than he originally thought. In Pre-Hibernation Week, he smiles when Sandy announces that SpongeBob disappeared, but of course SpongeBob comes back. In Welcome to the Chum Bucket, he expresses joy when SpongeBob is forced to leave the Krusty Krab, and of course SpongeBob comes back again. As we've seen on multiple occasions, Squidward has frequently expressed a desire to get rid of SpongeBob and Patrick, because SpongeBob and Patrick have definitely annoyed Squidward many, many times. But the last episode I want to analyze with respect to this topic is my personal favorite episode of the entire SpongeBob SquarePants series, and that is SB129. SB129 is my favorite SpongeBob episode of all time.
Thanks.
Of the over 100 episodes I've mentioned in this 2-hour-long video, this episode, SB129, is my favorite. And it's because I believe it to be the most truly creative episode of the entire series, and I believe it also touches more deeply on the inner philosophy of the show than any other episode before or after it, which is so striking because it was attempted so early on, still in the very first season. And thus I feel this episode, with its sheer ingenuity, represents exactly what I admire so much about the early creation of SpongeBob. It's the first episode where animated text is used in the title card, the first episode where the title is read out loud, and where the opening credits are somewhere else besides a sandy ocean floor. It's the first episode to use wildly different background art in both the future and past settings. It has probably the most memorable and daring abstract sequence of the entire show when Squidward enters the existential nowhere zone, and it's the very first episode of the entire show to center around a character other than SpongeBob. And the character chosen for that role was Squidward. The most inventive episode of the show is told from Squidward's perspective, because only he possesses the nuance and mental capability and human relatability to process this more thematically complex episode, which is why he's my favorite character. Anyways, the beginning of the episode sees SpongeBob and Patrick trying to ask Squidward to go jellyfishing, and in an attempt to escape from them, Squidward hides in the freezer of the Krusty Krab, only to accidentally lock himself for 2,000 years.
I'll be out of here in no time.
2,000 years later.
Here he is awakened by Spongetron, a futuristic version of SpongeBob, and in the future he finds out that everything is chrome.
Everything is chrome in the future.
Squidward starts to panic, and Spongetron suggests jellyfishing, the same activity that caused Squidward to run away from SpongeBob and Patrick in the present. When Spongetron suggests jellyfishing, a futuristic version of Patrick named Patron appears, and then they direct Squidward to a time machine, which Squidward takes until he arrives thousands of years in the past in prehistoric times. Here, Squidward meets prehistoric versions of SpongeBob and Patrick, when he finds out that these two imbeciles have no idea what to do with a jellyfish, taking turns getting repeatedly shocked by it. And so one of the most ironic moments of the series occurs when Squidward takes the time to teach these two how to jellyfish. This leads to the final joke of the episode when Squidward returns to the present and asks, "Who's the barnacle head who invented jellyfishing anyways?" And SpongeBob and Patrick reply saying,
"You are Squidward."
Going back.
Something I've thought about SB129 is that with the presence of SpongeBob and Patrick in past, present, and future, it suggests an inevitability that Squidward has to face. That no matter what, when, or where, he can't escape SpongeBob or Patrick. They are ubiquitous in every timeline he visits, and so is jellyfishing. And not only that, but the ironic fact that he invented jellyfishing implies a fundamental inability to escape, because you can't run away from something that came from yourself. In a past interview, Stephen Hillenburg said that he purposely placed Squidward's house in the middle between SpongeBob and Patrick's to symbolize how he's permanently caught in the crossfire of their antics, and he's forever going to be stuck between the two, whether he likes it or not, because there is inevitability. Anyways, the moment everybody talks about from SB129 is the sequence when Squidward accidentally breaks the time machine and gets transported to a blank white space called the Nowhere Dimension. Squidward seems to have ripped apart the fabrics of space and time and entered somewhere that is nowhere and no when at all, which is an insanely wacky concept to introduce in a children's television show. But yeah, in this dimension where nothing and nobody exists, Squidward feels he can at least finally take comfort in being by himself.
I can be all alone.
Hello.
Because that's what he wishes for, right? To be away from SpongeBob and Patrick and the rest of the idiots in Bikini Bottom. What follows next is a very unsettling sequence where multiple instances of the word alone appear in different fonts. But what's so disturbing isn't so much the eerie voices that appear out of nothingness, it's how easily and quickly the words and voices are reduced to less than a speck of nothingness in an ocean of white. And this is when Squidward comes to the terrifying realization he does not want to be alone. It's easy to read the emotions of this scene and the implied sentiment. The scene very succinctly conveys the terror of being alone so that even children can understand it. But I've also tried to closely think about what this scene is trying to say, what I believe it's ambitiously trying to say in a cosmic sense, given the unprecedented breadth of this episode. Like, what does it mean to be alone? I believe that being alone in this sense can mean wishing to cut oneself off from the rest of the universe. And when the universe is crazy, irrational, and absurd, it's easy to understand why someone might wish that. When I see the white space of the Nowhere Dimension, I interpret it as being given the choice. If you don't like the universe, here's a space-time you can go where none of it exists or matters. In ways, I see the empty nothingness of nowhere as the evident resolution of futility, where if you've truly fully given up and lost all hope and feel like you have nowhere to go, this is where you go. And so Squidward is given a choice to fully submit to futility. And SB129 rejects this notion. Squidward rejects futility. He does not want to be alone. He struggles for life, for his place in the universe, and he desperately searches for a way out. And in his impassioned resistance against futility, he makes a shocking admission before being transported back to the present. He says, of all things, I even miss SpongeBob. SpongeBob, the beacon of optimism, the pinnacle of innocence, purity, and hope, and the most annoying pain in Squidward's ass, and the supposed antithesis to every fiber of Squidward's being. In the dredges of nothingness and futility, Squidward spouts acceptance for his foil and even all the absurdity he represents. And in this plea for hope, for life, Squidward is finally transported back to the present, except this time, he is perhaps better prepared to face a crazy, irrational world than he was before. And now, we've reached the very final part of the essay, and this is where I want to talk about all the episodes where Squidward re-examines his relationship with SpongeBob. Squidward, as we've deliberated over many times now, has always seen SpongeBob as an oppositional force, but there have been times where they've worked together, sometimes more incidentally, like Pressure, where Squidward stands alongside SpongeBob in an act of racial solidarity in his feud with Sandy over land versus sea creatures.
What?
Or Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 5, where Squidward joins a superhero team with SpongeBob, albeit begrudgingly and after coercion from Mr. Krabs. Speaking of Mr. Krabs, the primary source of context that motivated SpongeBob and Squidward's occasional camaraderie has always been their relationship as employees of the Krusty Krab. For example, in Bossy Boots, Squidward urges SpongeBob to work with him to resist against Mr. Krabs putting Pearl in charge of the Krusty Krab. In Squid on Strike, when Mr. Krabs becomes absurdly cheap, Squidward and SpongeBob go on strike together, after which Squidward gets trampled multiple times and then eventually has a horrifying realization that he might be stuck staying on strike with SpongeBob forever.
Forever! 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 Forever!
Which terrifies him. But then Squidward indirectly motivates SpongeBob to literally dismantle the Krusty Krab board by board. After which Mr. Krabs says to repay the damages to the restaurant, SpongeBob and Squidward will have to work for him forever.
In order to pay off these damages, you two are gonna work for me forever!
This episode really repeats the theme of inevitability that I've mentioned before, and how SpongeBob and Squidward really will always be stuck together. In Can You Spare a Dime, SpongeBob and Squidward are once again pitted together against Mr. Krabs, but Mr. Krabs accuses Squidward of stealing his lucky dime, causing Squidward to quit. This kind of leads to a flipping of the script, because SpongeBob starts suffering at Squidward's expense when he offers to take care of Squidward, and the more rigidly Squidward stays in place, the angrier SpongeBob gets, and this leads to one of SpongeBob's biggest freakouts.
What are you saying?
Listen, you crustaceous cheapskate! Squidward's been living at my house, driving me crazy, and you're not gonna hire him back all because of a stupid dime! What's that?
And the big reveal at the end of this episode is that Mr. Krabs' dime is this giant boulder-looking thing, and it makes no sense that Mr. Krabs could have possibly misplaced something as huge as this. But what's even more absurd is that Mr. Krabs has the audacity to still accuse Squidward of stealing his dime, which in turn causes SpongeBob to submit to futility and don his maid outfit again because he accepts that things cannot be changed. Crabborg is probably one of the most classic episodes of SpongeBob and Squidward working together against Mr. Krabs. This is the one where SpongeBob and Squidward start breaking a bunch of appliances because they think Mr. Krabs is a robot.
What? You think I'm a robot?
We don't think, we know.
Which is one of the most delusional accusations ever, and it's revealed to be a pointless endeavor because not only was Mr. Krabs not a robot, but also because SpongeBob only heard about robots from a fictional movie, and even in the movie, the robots were revealed to be part of a dream and not real there either. Because just as we've seen several times before, many episodes of SpongeBob end with a punchline that the actions of characters are rendered pointless or futile at the end. In Clams, SpongeBob and Squidward work together again because Mr. Krabs becomes maniacal and obsessed when trying to get back his millionth dollar. However, unlike previous examples of obsession, Mr. Krabs does successfully resolve his desire, albeit at the cost of sacrificing his entire body. In Born Again Krabs, Mr. Krabs is once again a deplorable cheapskate.
You almost tore a man's arm off for a penny.
Even after SpongeBob is the only person to stand up for him against the Flying Dutchman, Mr. Krabs trades SpongeBob's soul for 62 cents.
If you had to choose between SpongeBob and all the money I have in my pocket, which would you take?
That depends. How much money are we talking about?
Mr. Krabs!
62 cents.
I'll take the money.
Mr. Krabs!
But when he does, it's Squidward who speaks up for SpongeBob and chastises Mr. Krabs for his decision.
He stuck up for you and you sold him out. You should be ashamed of yourself!
Anyways, the very best episode to depict SpongeBob and Squidward unexpectedly working together at the behest of Mr. Krabs it's one of the most integral episodes of the entire show, and it's so fundamental to the core themes that it was almost developed as the first episode of the entire show. And that episode is Pizza Delivery.
The Krusty Krab pizza is the pizza for you and me. The Krusty Krab pizza is the pizza.
And my feet are killing me.
I've mentioned before that the very first pitch idea Stephen Hillenburg had for SpongeBob involved SpongeBob and Squidward going on a road trip together, and this idea, while not used for the pilot, eventually got reworked into Pizza Delivery. I believe this episode was the first proposed by Hillenburg because it represents the most fundamental themes of the show, the absurdity of hope, and also SpongeBob's relationship with Squidward. This is the first major episode of the series to focus entirely on their character dynamic. At the beginning of the episode, a customer asks the Krusty Krab to deliver a pizza, and Mr. Krabs orders SpongeBob and Squidward to set out on said delivery. Against all logic and common sense, SpongeBob manages to get their boatmobile lost in the middle of nowhere, and the moment they step out of the vehicle, the boatmobile nonsensically reanimates and drives off by itself, presumably back to where they came from. It's a very absurd situation, and throughout the episode, SpongeBob and Squidward are at odds. SpongeBob insists on delivering the pizza to the customer, while Squidward just wants to not starve and eat the pizza. SpongeBob also repeatedly references methods used by the pioneers that Squidward scoffs at, but the irony is that SpongeBob's methods were correct, because Moss does point in the direction of civilization, which Squidward walks away from, and SpongeBob is able to drive a rock to save the day. The most interesting part about pizza delivery, though, is the ending, when they realize that the customer not only lives right next to the Krusty Krab, but the customer doesn't even want the pizza, getting angry when the order doesn't have any drink. The entire journey feels completely pointless, and this is when Squidward makes an interesting decision. Squidward, who spent the entire episode wanting to eat the pizza and claiming to not care about the customer at all, tries a second time to deliver the pizza, and he does it for SpongeBob. Because he saw how sad the rejection made SpongeBob, and despite all his annoyance at and disdain for SpongeBob, Squidward makes a decision to show compassion for the person he spent a journey in the desert with, and he throws the pizza in the customer's face.
Look, I told you, little friend, I ain't paying for that!
Well, this one's on the...
Pizza Delivery is one of the first episodes to show that, despite his grumpiness and cynicism and ego, Squidward can show himself to sometimes be a decent and noble person. It's the first episode where he shows compassion for and acknowledgement of SpongeBob, doing something just to make SpongeBob happy. He accepts the role of delivering the pizza. He accepts the nonsensical way they're driving on a rock, and he begins, even if just a little bit, to accept SpongeBob as well. Other episodes where Squidward shows compassion for SpongeBob include SB129, which we've already talked at length about, when Squidward states that he even misses SpongeBob, Dying for Pie, another episode we've already talked about, where Squidward helps SpongeBob with his bucket list just to make him happy because he thinks SpongeBob is going to die. And at the end of Graveyard Shift, which we've also already talked about, when Squidward falsely believes he might die at the hand of the hash-slinging slasher, he blurts out to SpongeBob that, "No matter what I said, I always sort of liked you.
SpongeBob, no matter what I've said, I've always sort of liked you.
Squidward, I used your clarinet to unclog my toilet.
Huh?
Which is a startling admission, but as we started to see over the course of this analysis, Squidward shares a lot more in common with SpongeBob than we might initially think. And whether conscious of it or not, Squidward has always occasionally demonstrated an appreciation for, or a desire to understand, or an attempt to emulate the absurdity and nonsense SpongeBob represents. Because it's fun, and it sure beats Futility. There are 2 more episodes I want to discuss regarding Squidward showing compassion or a change of heart regarding SpongeBob. And the first is Fools in April. Fools in April is the final episode of season 1 to feature Squidward in a major role. So if SpongeBob ended with 1 season, I like to think of this episode as representative of where SpongeBob and Squidward's relationship might have left off. The premise of this episode is that it's April Fool's Day, and SpongeBob pulls a series of benign pranks that annoy Squidward. And in retaliation, Squidward takes it too far by making a trap that catches SpongeBob and swings him around, slamming him all over the Krusty Krab. And I have to say, this sequence is probably the hardest we've ever seen Squidward laugh in the entire series, because it's one of the few instances where Squidward deliberately tries to have fun and attempts to be like SpongeBob, which is why he has so much enjoyment, because he rarely lets himself go like this. But he doesn't realize his methods are far more malicious and hurtful than the type of fun SpongeBob endorses, and the juxtaposition of cruel acts of physical punishment SpongeBob endures against Squidward's deliriously cackling face is wonderfully dark humor for sure. Except Squidward isn't a sociopath, and when he realizes the wrong he has done, he genuinely does feel bad. And again we see a capability for compassion in Squidward, as he then struggles to overcome his inability to apologize to SpongeBob. Squidward struggles to apologize to SpongeBob because he has an immense amount of pride. He's characteristically condescending to others, and especially to people like SpongeBob. But because Squidward is deep down a decent person, he overcomes that pride, and at the end of the episode, he apologizes profusely to SpongeBob, repeatedly saying he's sorry, and not only that, but he also says,
I didn't mean to hurt you. In fact, SpongeBob, I like you. I like living next door. I like hearing your foghorn alarm in the morning and your high-pitched giggling at night. I also like Gary, Patrick, Sandy, Mr. Krabs, and all the other people I'm forced to be in contact with.
And this is probably the most heartfelt and sincere moment Squidward has ever had on the entire show. Studio executives probably decided to reel it back after this episode because I don't think Squidward ever makes a prolonged admission like this again in the series, because giving someone too much character development hurts the longevity of the series. But as I mentioned before, this is the second to last episode of the first season, and back then, nobody knew the commercial juggernaut SpongeBob would become, or if it would extend beyond a first season. And so if SpongeBob ended here, I feel like this episode represents what could have been a natural end to SpongeBob and Squidward's evolving relationship across the first season. Squidward reveals verbatim that he does indeed have an appreciation for not just SpongeBob, but everyone in Bikini Bottom that he pretends to despise, as his persona of condescension is one of self-denial. Deep down, he wants to be silly, he wants to have fun, he wants to be as optimistic and ready just like SpongeBob, but because he's afraid of how the world will actually react, he uses cynicism as a facade. And of course, this moment is undercut with SpongeBob revealing that everybody's listening as an April Fool's prank on Squidward, which gives Squidward an exit strategy, an opportunity to say everything he just said was a joke, allowing him to return to his old self as he runs off cackling with desperate embarrassment. And SpongeBob gives the concluding remarks on Squidward's journey, saying not just to the people at his house, but to all of us as well,
what would we do without Squidward?
What would we do without Squidward? Because yes, what would we do without the best, most well-rounded, most dynamic, and most relatable character of the entire show? Anyways, Fools in April is probably the most conclusive episode concerning SpongeBob and Squidward's relationship, but there's one more episode to mention regarding instances of Squidward showing compassion to SpongeBob, and that is Christmas Who. This is the Christmas special where SpongeBob hypes up all of Bikini Bottom for the arrival of Santa Claus, and Squidward is the only one who remains unenthusiastic and even openly skeptical of the situation. And unfortunately, Santa Claus initially does not arrive, and SpongeBob becomes very sad, which is when the episode unexpectedly shifts to Squidward's perspective. I find it curious that the very first extended SpongeBob special chooses to focus on Squidward as the main character. The first time they ever extend an episode beyond 11 minutes, they choose to dedicate that runtime to Squidward of all the characters. It really speaks to the integral role he plays in the series, because again, just like when SpongeBob was sad in Pizza Delivery or Fools in April, Squidward makes it his mission to cheer SpongeBob up. And he does so by assuming the role of absurdity himself when he pretends to be Santa Claus, an entity who I think we can all agree is an absurd concept. And Squidward ends up being the one to save the day, and he does it all for the one person he previously mocked and made fun of, and who he has always been at odds with the entire series, SpongeBob. Anyways, having talked for almost 2 hours now, I can now say we have finally reached the very final part of the video essay. This entire essay I've talked at extreme length analyzing every episode Squidward makes a major appearance in, and I've tried to categorize these episodes in the context of various aspects of Squidward's character, and the thesis I've been trying to push this entire video is how I believe, when pertaining to Squidward, SpongeBob is a show that revolves around absurdity, obsession, and futility. We've talked about how Squidward is a character with many wants, and how these wants often go unfulfilled, and how the world seems to be immediately fixed against him, with rules that are irrational and make no sense, which can be relatable because life in the real world often feels unpredictable and out of control. And when we are continually denied our wants, when we repeatedly disappoint ourselves and endlessly suffer, we might become cynical like Squidward, and also be driven to either obsession or futility. Squidward has many wants, which are never satisfied, and what does he want? He wants fame, fortune, recognition, peace of mind, and most essentially, he wants to be happy. But when it comes to recognition, who does he want to be recognized by? He probably wants to be recognized by the citizens of Bikini Bottom, the people he looks condescendingly towards because he feels they don't understand his talent. But more than the common public, Squidward yearns for recognition from the cultured and accomplished members who reside at the top of society, the elite. Squidward wishes to be one of the elite, because attaining such status would solidify the validation he feels he needs to look down on other people, which he thinks is a way to be happy. But who are the actual members of the so-called elite? Monty P. Moneybags from Artist Unknown is one such example, whoever this guy is on the cover of Fancy Living Digest is another, but the most infamous member of the snobby and insufferably fancy elite that Squidward so doggedly aspires to join is Squilliam Fancy Son. Squilliam Fancy Son is the epitome of everything Squidward wants to be, of everything Squidward lacks.
So, I just took my private yacht across my private lake to my private heliport. It's the only way off my private island.
He's popular, he's rich, he's presumably talented, and he's hot.
Try to imagine him in his underwear. Oh no, he's hot!
He has everything Squidward could possibly want, and he has a horribly sneering and insulting attitude when speaking to Squidward, except his condescension might actually be justified because he has the clout to back it up. Squidward might believe that Squilliam deserves to look down on him because Squilliam is indeed better than him in every way, which is a really sad thought. Squidward has spent much of the series never fulfilling his wants, and if the world was equally unfair to everyone and nobody else he knew could attain their lofty aspirations, that could be of some small comfort to Squidward. But instead, Squilliam exemplifies that it is indeed possible to gain these wants, and that the fault for Squidward's own pathetic circumstances really falls on only himself, which must make him feel especially worthless. Inevitably, in our lives, there exist people who will be better than us in some way. There are probably many people who are better than us in almost every way, because some people really just do have it all. And even if it makes us feel terrible, there will always be vast inequalities in the world with ever widening gaps, and there's nothing we can really do about it except mind our business and try our best at what we can do. But if one of these privileged people decided to come down and rub it in our faces, I think someone like Squidward should have every right to be pissed. Squilliam Returns to me is just a really sad episode. It depicts Squilliam gloating and touting his success over Squidward, and Squidward, desperate to show up Squilliam, lies that he owns a fancy restaurant, but the plan is a catastrophic debacle, and Squidward is forced to fess up that he is just a cashier. And Squilliam really rubs Squidward's wounds into the dirt when for a brief moment he pretends that he too lied about being rich and is also just a cashier.
The horrible, sad truth is, I'm a cashier too!
And Squidward almost believes him, asking,
"Is that true?" Of course not! I'm filthy stinking rich! Come on, everyone! Let's all take a ride in my balloon/casino!
Even at Squidward's lowest point, Squilliam briefly brings up Squidward's hopes and then quickly crushes it into the dirt. At the end of this episode, Squidward has done nothing to close the gap between him and the aspirations Squilliam represents. He is only humiliated and reminded of the inevitable pathetic position he holds, which is why it's incredibly fitting that Mr. Krabs should play the world's saddest song on the world's smallest violin.
Would you get out of here?
because this is truly probably the saddest moment for Squidward in the entire series. One of the saddest lines of the episode occurs when SpongeBob walks by Squidward and asks, "What's going on with you?" And with a desolate, defeated expression on his face, Squidward replies with,
"Oh, the usual."
"Oh, the usual." Which is incredibly depressing because it insinuates that this wretched state of humiliating disappointment and self-loathing, this is a norm in Squidward's life. It has become a norm that he has submitted to shouldering this debilitating feeling of regret and self-hatred through every waking moment of his pathetic, miserable life. This awful, horrible feeling of painful jealousy when watching people you know and hate get everything you ever wanted while you continue to only have nothing. It's a deplorable, disgusting feeling. And so when Mr. Krabs plays the sad song on the world's smallest violin, I believe the scene to be representative of the utmost futility Squidward has ever faced in his downtrodden life. I believe it to be representative of a tragedy we all might experience in our own lives during times when we too feel we might never be enough. It's a tragedy and humiliation that I believe motivates the debased cynicism Squidward holds. A cynicism that he will never fulfill his wants, that he will never attain his artistic aspirations, and that he will never, ever, ever come close to defeating Squilliam in his life. The last episode I want to talk about is the one that I'm sure everyone has been waiting to finally get mentioned this entire video. It's the episode almost unanimously regarded as the greatest SpongeBob episode of all time. It's an episode filled with laughs and tears and an absurd placement of a thoroughly random but powerfully moving 90s rock ballad. It's an episode that we all know as Band Geeks. And it's an episode that centers around Squidward. I don't think it's a coincidence that the best SpongeBob episode of all time is one that revolves around Squidward, because we all know that Squidward is already the greatest SpongeBob character of all time. Band Geeks is the episode where Squidward gets an unexpected call from Squilliam. My headcanon is that Band Geeks occurs chronologically after Squilliam Returns, even though Squilliam Returns is released later in production order, and Squilliam Returns is also called, well, Squilliam Returns. I just like to believe that Band Geeks takes place after Squilliam Returns, and I'm not gonna argue that. Anyways, Squidward gets a call from Squilliam, and Squilliam goads Squidward, making fun of the fact that Squidward might not have a band and be a cashier. And while that is true, Squidward snaps and lies that he does have a band and that he will play at the Bubble Bowl and prove Squilliam wrong. The premise of Band Geeks is essentially identical to that of Squilliam Returns, but everyone likes Band Geeks better. Both episodes involve Squidward unexpectedly running into Squilliam, who arrogantly brags to Squidward about being better in some cultural field. And in both cases, Squidward, feeling cornered, lies about having more experience than he actually has. I like to see the episodes as two flip sides of the same coin, of two equally probable outcomes to the same scenario, with Squilliam Returns representing what easily could have happened if things went wrong. So what if things didn't go wrong? Well, it initially doesn't work out that way in Band Geeks. Initially, the band Squidward hires is woefully incompetent, playing music terribly, asking dumb questions like,
"Is mayonnaise an instrument?"
No, Patrick, mayonnaise is not an instrument. Horseradish is not an instrument either.
And getting into lots of fights.
Well, maybe we wouldn't sound so bad if some people didn't try to play with big, meaty claws.
What did you say, punk?
Big, meaty claws!
And so, even though he tried his best to make the band practice for 5 days, Squidward eventually breaks down and gives up, because he realizes the all too common futility of his situation. And this is when he confronts the band he gathered and gives a tearful monologue in what is probably his most emotionally vulnerable moment in the entire series. Well, you did it. You took my one chance in happiness and crushed it. Crushed it into little, tiny, bite-sized pieces. I really had expected better of you people. I guess I'm a loser for that too. Don't bother showing up tomorrow. I'll just tell them you all died in a marching accident. So thanks. Thanks for nothing. The most important sentence of this speech to me is in the beginning. You took my one chance in happiness and crushed it. This was indeed Squidward's one and closest chance he's ever had at happiness, because if you think about it, at no point throughout the series until now has Squidward ever succeeded in finding happiness. I've talked at length about how Squidward has only endlessly suffered and never had any of his wants fulfilled, about how essentially all his wants are fundamentally conceived from a desire to be happy, and yet they still fail. The only other time Squidward has expressed any excitement or joy in the series, it's usually a throwaway joke, or it's short-lived and undercut by some subsequent act of suffering. The only times I can say Squidward experiences genuine happiness are the instances we have examined where he shows compassion to SpongeBob, like pizza delivery and Christmas Who. But one of those is a Christmas episode, a scenario that mandates happiness. And these instances are more so a warm, wholesome happiness that one gets from helping others. It's not a typical kind of ecstatic joy one would achieve from finally succeeding in their own personal goals. Squidward's actual goals are never satisfied at any point in the series, because at the beginning of this essay, I talked about how cartoons are instantiated with inevitability, and that Squidward will inevitably never fulfill his wants or achieve his goals. And for most of SpongeBob, this case holds true. But not with Band Geeks. Band Geeks is the most popular and widely loved episode of SpongeBob because it is the first and only time in the entire series that Squidward achieves an all-out slam dunk victory. This episode is a catharsis of so many pent-up emotions, of all the obsession Squidward has built up with every failure over an entire series. It is an antithesis to every experience Squidward has had until this point, by being the standalone successful fantasy, the ultimate comeback victory, and the most satisfyingly sweet redemption in a wide, wide sea of misery. The freeze frame at the end of the episode of Squidward jumping in the air is the single most unequivocally happiest expression of uncontained jubilation and long-awaited joy ever shown by any character on the show, and this beautiful, singular moment was dedicated to Squidward of all characters. Band Geeks is the most highly rated episode in reviews and episode rankings because of how starkly different it is from the rest of the series. But the rest of the series and the rest of Squidward's suffering must all still exist to give this episode's contrast more power. This is the only episode in the entire series where Squidward triumphs over obsession and futility, and finally gets what he wants despite how impossible it has always seemed. But the important question to ask is, how does Squidward finally attain this happiness? And the answer to that is SpongeBob. SpongeBob is the key ingredient to securing Squidward's success in this episode. He's the character who rallies the band together and turns them into professionals in one night. And that honestly makes no sense. It's irrational, it's absurd, but SpongeBob has always been the shining example of demonstrating absurd ability, and he's able to do so because his intentions are pure-hearted, leading the band and coming together to help his friend in need. But what's more important to note here is that Squidward could not have found happiness without SpongeBob. Squidward needed SpongeBob to win, and I think that's why Squidward was finally able to succeed. In this episode, at his lowest of lows, he finally accepts SpongeBob, because instead of flat out rejecting SpongeBob when he arrives at the Bubble Bowl, he nervously goes along with the plan, not knowing what to expect. For the first time, he takes a leap of faith and puts his fate into SpongeBob's hands. And not just SpongeBob, but the rest of Bikini Bottom, as this episode is one of the few times where almost the entire cast joins together in unison on screen. And the performance they put on is absolutely absurd, taking place in a live-action football stadium with some ugly-looking fish.
These are some ugly-looking fish.
SpongeBob proceeds to sing in a completely different, soulfully masculine voice, belting out a Journey-esque 90s rock ballad song, which is just so completely out of place in a children's television show about underwater fish, but so completely on brand for SpongeBob. Because SpongeBob has always been, at its most rudimentary core, a show about the surreal and the absurd. Because the world of SpongeBob is crazy, fantastical, and strange, just like the mystical oceanic worlds that Stephen Hillenburg explored when he watched the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau as a child. The world is so unpredictable and may very often feel like it's beyond our depth or outside of our control, but that doesn't mean we can't have fun with it. When SpongeBob sees absurdity, he sees it as an exciting opportunity to experience wonderful, inspiring things. And while Squidward has previously turned his big nose at the absurd, and even previously identified as a victim of the absurd, in this episode, he embraces SpongeBob's weirdness and joins the rest of the band in the most memorable and epic musical performance television has ever witnessed. If there's one thing I want to impart onto viewers after this very long and winding video, it's that if you're ever feeling like Squidward, if you feel like things are always going wrong and life is weighing you down, I just want to let you know that you can eventually win, because even Squidward eventually gets his day. Or, if that's too simplistic, more than that, what I want to say is, in this 4-month-long journey that I personally took after reading many interviews about SpongeBob and watching and analyzing so many SpongeBob episodes, or no, in a decades-long journey of me watching SpongeBob episodes over and over and over again over my entire life, I just want to say that it's okay to feel cynical at times. It's normal and everybody does. And it's okay to be selfish sometimes as well. Even though Squidward is often cynical and selfish, we still all like him, but we should also be wary of letting our cynicism devolve into obsession and futility. If we feel our goals are infeasible, if we feel the parameters of our situation are too chaotic and irrational, we should take a step back and reassess what it is we're trying to achieve. Too often we become focused on wanting to achieve just one thing, when really what we might need is a change of perspective. Absurdism posits that the world is unpredictable and irrational, but rather than view this as a limitation, we can use it as a tool for our own success. SpongeBob is very often described as a surrealist masterpiece, where surrealism is an artistic movement that seeks to release the creative potential of the unconscious mind and superimpose its chaotic images onto reality. It seeks to find beauty in that which we cannot understand, whether it be the illogical or the absurd. And to all the people watching this video, I urge you to find not just beauty, but humor and joy and any other emotion that fulfills you in this wide, tumultuous world over which we have little control. Open your hearts to that which you do not understand, to people who you might feel are very different from yourself. And if you do that, maybe, just maybe, one day you too will find your sweet, sweet victory.